Broadband connectivity is a critical part of everyday life. Ordinary activities like work, education, healthcare now require a high-speed internet connection. Yet millions of Americans, particularly those in rural areas, still lack access to broadband and are unable to enjoy the benefits of connectivity. Over the past few years, Congress has made significant investments to bridge this digital divide, the most significant being the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, providing over $45 billion for broadband deployment. While funding is a key piece to the puzzle, it's not enough to make sure that people have access to broadband. We need to make sure new networks can be built in a timely and a cost-efficient manner. I firmly believe that the infrastructure bill was a missed opportunity to enact meaningful permitting reform that would have broken down barriers to deployment and stretched federal spending. Lengthy application reviews and excessive fees for deployment will only delay connectivity and increase costs, leaving behind those Americans and American families who lack reliable internet access. Without changes to the permitting process and meaningful oversight, all of this money set aside for broadband could be wasted. We cannot let that occur. Permitting reform is not just necessary to bridge the digital divide, it is necessary to help us continue to lead the world in next generation wireless technology. We will not beat China to 5G leadership if efforts to deploy new wireless infrastructure are delayed. I appreciate that the Federal Communications Commission has worked to streamline state and local permitting processes in this space. We need to codify and build on these reforms. The legislation we're reviewing today includes over 30 proposals that will help us streamline permitting at all levels of government, facilitating accelerated broadband deployment. These ideas include implementing shot clocks on state and local government reviews of permitting applications, capping fees, removing burdensome environmental and historic preservation reviews, and making it easier to deploy on federal lands. Enacting these policies would help providers receive an answer in a timely manner, reduce the burdens and costs for deployment, ensure that we connect people quickly. I am proud to once again lead the Wireless Leadership Act, which would help expedite the deployment of wireless infrastructure. This legislation would set timelines that state and local governments must abide by in reviewing applications and create a deemed grant remedy for reviews that miss deadlines. It would also reduce the cost of deployment by limiting the fees those governments can charge for reviewing applications and using a right-of-way. The bill does all this while preserving state and local zoning authority. I hope that we can make these bills bipartisan as we move through our regular order. This is not a partisan issue. Both Republicans and Democrats want to close this digital divide. And as I've said in the past, it's not a Republican, Democrat, or independent issue. It's all of our issue. The bills we are considering today will ensure we do so quickly and cost-effectively. I am pleased that the Biden administration recognizes the need for permitting reform and is encouraging states to streamline their permitting processes for broadband deployment. I hope we can work on this package together. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today, all of whom understand the challenge of deploying broadband. And again, I want to thank our witnesses for appearing before us. And at this time, I will recognize for 5 minutes the gentlelady from California, the ranking member of the subcommittee.
Thank you very much, Chairman Lada. The topic of today's hearing is an important one. If we're able to find bipartisan solutions that speed broadband deployment, we can accomplish a goal shared by all members of the subcommittee, getting connectivity to communities who need it. While I have some concerns about process and representation on the witness panel today, it is my hope that moving forward, we can get back to a more balanced approach that encourages bipartisan collaboration on a consequential issue. The small towns and hamlets in my district are desperate for modern internet connectivity. The mayors that reach out to me are ready to do whatever it takes to get their residents connected. This is something I know is not unique to me. Most of us on this subcommittee hear from our districts about the lack of broadband on a daily basis. These local governments understand the challenges they face better than anyone else. They know where broadband is available, where it's not, and the barriers they face to connectivity. I believe we must be supporting, not limiting, their efforts. These communities want broadband connectivity, and with the funding included in the bipartisan infrastructure bill, we have a historic opportunity to provide it. The bipartisan ILJA provided $65 billion to expand access to broadband through new deployment and adoption efforts. This includes $42 billion for the BEAD program, which will support deployment of new broadband infrastructure projects. BEAD will be successful because it addresses the fundamental impediment to broadband deployment, economics. In rural areas where populations are more spread out, private companies can't afford to deploy or operate a network. In those areas, the problem isn't permitting barriers, it's an unsustainable business case. Thankfully, Congress correctly recognized this dynamic with the bipartisan BEAD program. Continuing to support NTIA in the states as they implement BEAD is the single most powerful tool that we have to connect our unserved constituents. Let me repeat, it is a bipartisan BEAD program more than any bill on today's agenda that will be responsible for closing the digital divide. In both Republican and Democratic districts, this funding will soon result in shovels in the ground and homes coming online. If you haven't already, I'd encourage members to reach out to their state broadband offices. Let them know about the needs of your district and get engaged. Over this past recess, I held a roundtable with NTIA, the California Public Utilities Commission, and local officials to discuss broadband implementation. We outlined the broadband needs of the rural areas in my district and how all levels of government can work together to get them served. I believe that this type of federal, state, and local collaboration is a key to successful broadband deployment. Leveraging the expertise of all involved to connect communities is the right path forward. That's why I'm concerned that, as drafted, some of the proposals on the agenda today could undermine that collaboration. Rigid top-down federal preemption can never be as successful as meaningful incentives to support local collaboration and engagement. Having said that, it's clear that there are ample opportunities to support a more predictable, sustaining permitting process, especially at the federal level. Contradictory permitting requirements, unacceptable deadlines, and a confusing tangle of bureaucracy at the federal level has inhibited broadband deployment for far too long. This is especially a problem for western states, where federal lands can prevent middle-mile connections that serve as a bridge between communities. I'm hopeful we can find bipartisan agreement on issues like this, which can meaningfully speed up broadband deployment. We've done it before. I think about the bipartisan work on common sense, dig once policies led by Congresswoman Eshoo, or some of the consensus permitting items advanced by the FCC. So while I am disappointed by some aspects of this hearing, I'm committed to really continuing the discussion. There's more to be done providing clarity and responsiveness at the federal level, incentives for local engagement, and a more predictable process across the board. I want to thank our witnesses for appearing before us today, and I look forward to our discussion. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. The gentlelady yields back, and this time the chair recognizes for 5 minutes the chair of our full committee of Energy and Commerce, the gentlelady from Washington.
Good morning, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. In 2021, Congress wrote the largest check for broadband deployment in our nation's history, more than $42 billion for the Broadband Equity, Access, and Deployment, or BEAD program, $1 billion for the middle mile infrastructure deployment, an additional $2 billion for deployment on tribal lands, and $2 billion for rural broadband deployment through the Department of Agriculture. These funds are just a small fraction of the funding appropriated over the past several years that could have been used for deploying broadband. This is an historical opportunity in our nation's history to connect all Americans, and we cannot allow permitting delays and unnecessary cost to mess it up. Unfortunately, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act spent more money without the needed fixes to the burdensome permitting process. We need to lift regulatory burdens, cut the red tape, roll out the red carpet. Without removing barriers to deployment, a record amount of taxpayer money will be wasted. This means that rural Americans will continue to watch from a distance as technologies advance. Kids will go without access to online educational resources, and businesses in rural America will be left behind as the digital economy continues to boom in urban centers across the globe. This issue should not be partisan. The federal funding wave is coming. The BEAD program will begin awarding money for deployment as early as the end of this year, in addition to the deployment that is already happening from both private and public investments. It was good news last year that the National Telecommunication and Information Administration encouraged states to identify steps to reduce cost and barriers to deployment, promote the use of existing infrastructure, promote and adopt dig once policies, streamline permitting processes, and cost-effective access to poles, conduits, easements, and rights of way. But encouraging and promoting these actions is not enough. It's time for Congress to act and pass substantive permitting reform like the legislative discussion drafts we're considering today. The bills being discussed today offer a wide variety of needed improvements to existing permitting requirements at the federal, state, and local levels. I'm proud to lead the Wildfire Wireless Resiliency Act as a part of our legislative agenda. In wake of a disaster, communities need to be reconnected as quickly as possible when their networks go down. Communications providers working to reconnect victims to the systems that provide access to public safety, healthcare, and resources should not be tied up in regulatory nightmares. Under this new legislation, projects to rebuild damaged or destroyed communication facilities will be exempt from NEPA and historical preservation review, which would have already occurred from the original communications facility to be built. We don't need another round of environmental or historic review when there's already existing infrastructure. And this is one of many we will discuss today that enacts reasonable permitting reforms. Members across this committee are putting forth excellent solutions that guarantee these important federal funds are going to go towards deployment as Congress intended and communities need. I look forward to hearing from the witnesses, to our rural and urban constituents currently under and unserved. Broadband is on the way. I'm hopeful that we can get it to you faster in a less costly manner. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey, the ranking member of the full committee, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Bridging the digital divide has been a top priority of this committee for years, and in 2021, Democrats delivered on that promise with passage of the bipartisan infrastructure law. This law made historic investments in broadband that will help connect millions of Americans to high-speed, affordable, and reliable broadband regardless of income or zip code. And I look forward to discussing today how we can build upon the investments we've already made to continue bridging the divide. For years, House Democrats have championed the need to make government investments in areas where the private markets have failed to build out broadband networks equitably and affordably. Far too many people in these communities, the lack of high-speed, reliable internet means not having the opportunity to do basic things that many of us now take for granted, like applying for a job, telehealth appointments, or completing schoolwork from home. All told, the Biden administration will provide more than $60 billion across a number of programs to bring state-of-the-art broadband networks to families and households in primarily unserved and rural communities, tribal lands, and other unconnected areas around the country. The overwhelming majority of these funds have yet to be distributed, and therefore the hard work in ensuring these funds and projects reach the people who need them mostly remains ahead of us. It's critical that we ensure states and communities are prepared to receive these funds and get projects moving quickly and efficiently. If there are impediments or delays that might jeopardize the smooth implementation of these programs, then we want to know about them. So it's important for this committee to hear from expert witnesses about potential issues, but that's not the point of today's hearing. Republicans have skipped right past an examination of the issues to potential solutions, which is unfortunate and defies logic. The subcommittee should first take the time to identify where the problems are before examining solutions. And this legislative hearing is, in my opinion, too broad. The 30 Republican discussion drafts on the agenda span a vast number of issues, amend a number of different federal laws, impact a number of different industry sectors, and state and local autonomy. The Republican majority invited 4 witnesses to cover these bills, and yet the chair rejected our request for a second Democratic witness for the panel. And I have deep concerns about that imbalance and the precedent it sets, especially because the Republican majority skipped holding an informational hearing. I believe that any discussion of these issues that does not include state and municipalities, tribal representatives, environmental justice communities, and other experts with relevant testimony is incomplete. The Republican majority's actions are inconsistent with their calls for bipartisan collaboration and unfortunately may make it harder to work together on these bills as they move forward. To be clear, if there are real obstacles in deploying broadband universally, we want to know about them and find ways to address them. But some of the Republican proposals before us today are supposed solutions to problems that simply do not exist. In fact, one of the clearest obstacles to reliable and affordable internet are state laws in more than a dozen states that prohibit municipalities from competing in the free market to build or operate their own broadband network if they choose. Representative Eshu's Community Broadband Act is critical to ensuring flexibility and competition for communities that want to provide this service for their residents, which is a successful model in many states. Representative Fletcher's Broadband Incentives for Communities Act would kickstart deployment efforts by providing resources to communities to deal with the influx of applications for these projects and others. So these two bills are real solutions as we bridge the digital divide. And obviously, I think that we need to investigate a lot of the background here before we move forward with these bills, Mr. Chairman. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back the balance of his time, and I'd like to point out for our witnesses that you will each have 5 minutes to address the committee. And also, I don't see in front of you, do we have the light, the timer in the front for the witnesses? Yep, I see we don't have it on the tabletops today, but you'll see that when the light turns yellow, that you each have 1 minute remaining, and then when it turns red, the time has expired. Our witnesses for today's meeting is Mr. Michael Romano, Executive Vice President of the NTCA, the Rural Broadband Association. Mr. Michael Saperstein, the Senior Vice President of Government Affairs and Chief Strategy Officer of the Wireless Infrastructure Association. Mr. Ernesto Falcone, the Senior Legislative Counsel, Electronic Frontier Foundation. Mr. Louis Finkel, the Senior Vice President of Government Relations, National Rural Electric Cooperative Association. And our final witness is the Honorable Michael O'Reilly, President of MP O'Reilly Consulting, Inc. And with that, Mr. Romano, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. To Chairwoman Morris Rogers, Ranking Member Pallone, Chairman Latta, Ranking Member Matsui, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the chance to testify this morning regarding how to accelerate the deployment of broadband networks. My name is Mike Romano. I am the Executive Vice President of NTCA, the Rural Broadband Association. We represent approximately 850 small community-based network operators who live in and serve the most rural parts of the United States. NTCA members have made extensive strides in deploying broadband in rural America. This gives them substantial experience and perspective on permitting and approvals relating to federal lands, highways of all kinds, and railroad crossings, among others. At the same time, they have more to do to upgrade their remaining customers, and they are actively engaged in expanding to reach unserved locations in other areas. This gives them a substantial interest in finding ways to improve and expedite permitting procedures where possible. My written statement provides a series of case studies involving NTCA members to highlight some of the most significant concerns they encounter in navigating current permitting laws and procedures. Examples include a provider who incurred $30,000 in engineering and environmental fees and delay of nearly a year to cross BLM land for one small part of a large fiber ring. A provider who was trying to upgrade a network to fiber in a previously disturbed right-of-way that took 9 months to approve despite a categorical exclusion under NEPA, with the approval coming too late to start construction during the winter. A provider who faced delays of nearly 2 years for historical and consultation processes under the National Historic Preservation Act for projects that were primarily in previously disturbed rights-of-way. And a provider who faced delays and fees of $12,000 simply to bore 15 feet under a railroad crossing. These examples and many more like them demonstrate how providers can face lengthy and frustrating delays and the need to expend substantial sums beyond the actual cost of construction to access federal lands or other rights-of-way for broadband deployment. What must not be missed, however, is that this is just the current state. Certainly, broadband deployment has accelerated over the past several years, but we are just on the precipice of even more massive investment as important, much-needed initiatives like the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, or BEAD, come online. These expanded efforts will lead to much greater demand for permits and approvals that threaten to exacerbate existing backlogs and could undermine a shared national objective of universal connectivity. While permitting is just one piece of the puzzle when it comes to the business case for rural broadband, it is a critical piece, and NTCA therefore greatly appreciates both the subcommittee's general attention to these issues and its specific consideration of various pieces of legislation aimed at promoting streamlining. Bills like the Broadband Leadership Act, the BEAD Fees Act, and the Reducing Barriers for Broadband on Federal Lands Act will help to facilitate fiber deployment in rural areas through a variety of measures outlined in those bills. I also highlight in my written statement how the subcommittee can make sure that other legislative measures under consideration here will streamline wireline and wireless deployments alike, and the need for further conversations regarding how to promote timely and cost-effective access to poles and railroad crossings. Finally, workforce development has become an important phrase in our national dialogue these days generally and in the broadband industry specifically. But as my written statement highlights, this concept is going to be essential as well in considering how to make permitting more efficient. As good and as skilled as many employees in federal, state, and local permitting offices may be, NTCA members consistently report that there appears to be a lack of staff resources necessary to handle the quantity of applications presented, leading to confusion, delay, and a lack of effective communication at times. For example, one NTCA member reported that the BLM office in a large western state had only 2 staffers tasked with reviewing all broadband, oil, and gas permitting applications there. Therefore, even as the subcommittee rightly and thoughtfully considers process improvements that can accelerate broadband deployment through the legislation presented, NTCA encourages attention as well to ensuring that permitting agencies and offices at all levels are staffed for the work to come, that these staff will be well trained for the important work they need to do, and that internal systems and procedures are in place within each agency to ensure more timely and effective communication with applicants. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. I look forward to the conversation today and answering your questions.
Well, thank you for your testimony, and Mr. Saperstein, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairwoman McMorris-Rogers, Ranking Member Pallone, Chairman Latta, Ranking Member Matsui, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for holding this timely hearing, highlighting the importance of efficient and streamlined infrastructure permitting reform. I'm Mike Saperstein, Senior Vice President of Government Affairs and Chief Strategy Officer for the Wireless Infrastructure Association, WIA. WIA represents the multitude of entities that make up the entire wireless ecosystem. We have never been closer to achieving our bipartisan goal of nationwide connectivity, making broadband available literally everywhere from dense urban cores to rural farmland. To realize our shared connectivity goals, we must also account for significant consumer demand for broadband connectivity on the move. Mobile broadband has never been more available, affordable, accessible, and competitive than it is today. We should acknowledge this win for the American people even while we finish our work. However, and this is the main message I want to impart today, infrastructure deployment is the fulcrum between the potential of historic broadband investment and the reality of universal connectivity. Our nation's broadband potential will ultimately be limited by the barriers we do not remove. That's why today's hearing is so important. What we're doing here today is fundamentally in exercising good government and sound management. If universal connectivity is Congress's priority, and there are 65 billion reasons to believe it is, then we must identify the things within our control preventing us from achieving that priority. Permitting processes serve a function, but common sense tells us that not every proposed action requires the same amount of scrutiny. And what we're asking for is straightforward. We simply seek a predictable application process proportionate to the project that will be decided in a timely manner. And when the answer is no, let us know why that is, and let's work together to resolve reasonable concerns. Fortunately, we're not starting from scratch. We can build on the existing policy, much like we can build on existing physical infrastructure and fill in the gaps that exist. Congressional action over the last decade, aided by the FCC's sensible interpretations, has been effective in reducing the gap between potential and actualized connectivity, and the results speak for themselves. 5G is being deployed at twice the speed of 4G. Siting activity in the 2 years following FCC reform exceeded the previous 7 years combined. And that's why these reforms must be maintained and strengthened as we attempt to cover the hardest remaining parts of America. Permit me to give a few examples of what WIA members experienced. Many jurisdictions were doing an end run around the application shot clock for co-location and minor modifications simply by claiming things like the locality lacks processing procedures and the shot clock can't start until those procedures are established. Or, most egregiously, simply refusing to accept an application to avoid triggering the shot clock. There was also endless debate about what constitutes a substantial change to the dimensions of a structure that make it eligible for streamlined review that the FCC's 5G upgrade order resolved. The FCC's interpretation of congressional action has gone a long way towards solving this problem, and we see an increasing partnership with local communities that understand the value of wireless connectivity. But the FCC's orders are subject to challenge. Today, the FCC's 2020 5G upgrade order is now under appeal in the Ninth Circuit. We appreciate the bills, like Chairman Latta's Wireless Leadership Act, that would codify and make permanent existing FCC interpretations. In Congress's own backyard, siting on federal lands continues to be a bedeviling issue, despite prior congressional action. More than anything, WIA members seek clarity, accountability, and transparency with respect to permitting on federal lands. Simple portals would help this. Similarly, there are resource-driven review issues at the FAA that could also use congressional attention. WIA supports codifying streamlined environmental reviews, which otherwise may not be commensurate with the undertaking and unnecessarily delay broadband deployments. Finally, WIA supports efforts to increase government's ability to prepare themselves for this increasing permitting demands across all divisions, federal, state, and local, a crucial effort as broadband providers push to connect every corner of this nation. Removing barriers to broadband deployment has long been a bipartisan goal of Congress and the executive branch. We agree. We look forward to discussing today the slate of bills at issue to determine how we can help remove those barriers. Thank you.
Well, thank you for your testimony. Mr. Falcone, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Latta, Ranking Member Matsui, and members of the subcommittee, my name is Ernesto Falcone, and I'm the Senior Legislative Counsel for the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Thank you for inviting me today to speak with you. My organization has been around for more than 30 years and has focused on the simple premise that a person's rights and liberties must be maintained or enhanced as technology advances. We have been at the forefront of studying the future of broadband access and how to get it to everyone, because without 21st century ready connectivity, you are not a full participant in society. We've conducted in-depth research and produced publications on the issue from both a legal and technical perspective. And for years, I have led the organization's research and analysis work and have interviewed the CEOs of ISPs, municipalities, industry consultants, cooperatives, financial experts, and many others involved in our broadband ecosystem. I hope to be of assistance to the subcommittee as we dig into how to ensure the success of BEAD. One thing is clear: fiber infrastructure underlies the advancement of all broadband access options, from fixed wireless to satellites to wireline. The IIJA Priority Broadband Projects provision is arguably one of the smartest course corrections we have made in telecom policy. Now, federal dollars must be spent on future-proof networks so we do not have to continually play a game of catch-up. In the past, we have spent billions subsidizing good enough for now access, only to find all of it obsolete within a few years. Now, Congress and the Biden administration has set forth a path for every state to deliver 21st century access infrastructure through fiber that will not need to be replaced for decades to come. Two objectives I think we all share here are predictable construction timelines and standardized costs when accessing public land. An unnecessary cost driver is delay, and I also think a lot of good can be done with standardizing fees when accessing public land in a way that is consistent and logical. There are fee structures out there that I've witnessed that actively undermine fiber deployment, and I detail that in my written testimony. Those types of structures would undermine the goals of BEAD. And I understand the attractiveness of shot clocks with deemed granted, and policy should favor expeditious review of permits to enhance BEAD, but the reality is increasing staffing resources to the relevant permitting agencies will likely yield better results. Most communities are eager but resource constrained to work with the ISPs to expand access. And ISPs are not able to know of all the possible complicating factors a public land might hold without involving the government agency in charge of managing it. And in terms of cities, ISPs are not fully aware of a city's infrastructure or the current status of the rights-of-way without the help of the local government. And any number of complications may occur if we view deployment as a unilateral matter. These need to be done in collaboration. Furthermore, running over local power, I believe, risks risk forgetting what we learned, forgetting what happened last time we did this nearly 20 years ago with the consolidation of franchise authorities in most states at the advent of fiber to the home. Study after study have showed that large ISPs favored the most lucrative targets of a community while foregoing equal upgrades to less desirable areas. This has created a two-tier broadband market where wealthy areas enjoy fiber-based broadband with faster speeds and lowering prices, while low-income areas are still stuck with legacy access that is both slower and more expensive. As part of IIJA, Congress found it necessary to remedy this problem by creating the Digital Discrimination Rulemaking Authority at the FCC. So it's important to keep local power involved to give them the flexibility to work with ISPs to ensure equitable outcomes. We cannot forget the E in BEAD, and local governments have traditionally served as the party to represent the interests of local communities. And we can't lose sight of the fact that a successful BEAD is one that delivers broadband access to all people without exception. Thank you again for inviting me here to speak. I look forward to your questions and hope to be of assistance.
And thank you very much for your testimony. Mr. Finkel, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Matsui, members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify today. My name is Louis Finkel, and I serve as the Senior Vice President for Government Relations at the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association, or NRECA. NRECA is the national service organization for more than 900 rural electric cooperatives that provide electric service to approximately 42 million people across 48 states. Rural electric cooperatives are member-owned, not-for-profit, and we were formed to provide safe, reliable electric service to their members at the most reasonable cost. Electric cooperatives are focused on people, not profits. A longstanding commitment to rural communities drives co-ops to identify ways to help build a better tomorrow. This obligation is not without challenges. More than 80 years ago, electric cooperatives were formed to bring affordable electricity to high-cost, low-density rural areas where large investor-owned utilities would not. Those same economic factors exist today for broadband delivery to those same areas. The cost of building and maintaining these networks in sparsely populated areas with difficult terrain is prohibitive for many providers. It is a cost-intensive process with little return on investment. Today, more than 200 electric cooperatives in 39 states are involved in rural broadband deployment efforts, whether as the internet provider themselves or through partnerships. Since cooperatives are owned by the people they serve, they truly understand the need for broadband in these areas and the challenges associated with deploying this infrastructure, which is why some co-ops have chosen to expand their services to include broadband. Simply put, co-ops are providing this service because no other provider will. The existing federal permitting process takes too long, is too expensive, and is an impediment to the ability of broadband providers to meet the needs of their consumers and communities. This process must be modernized to give more certainty and predictability to providers. The National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA regulations, present a significant challenge to rapid broadband deployment. Co-ops face NEPA requirements when seeking a variety of federal permits, approvals, and financial assistance, including access to power lines right-of-way on federal lands. In many instances, existing rights-of-way and easements only apply to electric service and not to broadband. When this happens, the utility must renegotiate the right-of-way or easement agreement with each state, each federal agency, local jurisdictions, and private landowners, which can take years and cost millions of dollars. Improving coordination amongst federal agencies is a simple common-sense step that can alleviate many challenges to rural broadband deployment and reduce both delays and costs for these projects. Even within the same agency, co-ops have experienced differing application of the rules when dealing with multiple regional or state offices. Similarly, duplicative reviews by federal agencies for broadband infrastructure placed on existing poles and existing right-of-ways only serve to slow down projects and make them more expensive. Streamlined approaches to actions that are known to have minimal environmental impacts will allow agencies to focus their time and resources on proposals that truly do have significant environmental impact. Similarly, ensuring that broadband maps are accurate before BEAD funds is distributed is critical to connecting unserved communities. Congress should provide flexibility to states to use their own maps and local knowledge in addition to the FCC maps when determining eligible locations for BEAD. As electric utilities, co-ops own and maintain utility poles and rights-of-way for for the safe and reliable distribution of electricity. When space and capacity allow, co-ops lease out excess space to their poles to communications providers. This relationship provides communications companies with access to an existing pole distribution network for a small fraction of the cost that the co-op community has incurred to build and maintain these systems. The fees charged to attach to co-op poles reflect the unique geographic and demographic characteristics of each co-op service territory, which can vary from state to state and co-op to co-op. If the Fair Poles Act were enacted, it would dissuade electric cooperatives from participating in recently created federal programs aimed at supporting broadband deployment in high-cost rural areas. Cooperatives are some of the most willing entities to bring broadband to those hardest to reach and most expensive communities, and adoption of the Fair Poles Act would unfairly change the rules of the game after providers have already gone through the complicated and costly process of applying for federal funding. Federal permitting process becomes even more challenging when multiple federal agencies are involved, and lengthy reviews coupled with unclear timelines and administrative burdens only add to the challenges and frustration of dealing with the federal government. NRECA and its members are deeply committed to bridging the digital divide and connecting rural families and businesses with reliable, high-speed internet. We appreciate the committee's timely attention to permitting issues and streamlining deployment so that families, no matter where they live, can access reliable, affordable internet connection that meets their needs today and into the future. I thank you for the opportunity and look forward to your questions.
Thank you for your testimony, and the chair now recognizes Mr. O'Reilly. Thanks very much for being with us. Good to see you back at the subcommittee, and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you to Subcommittee Chairman Lotta, Ranking Member Matsui, Full Committee Chair Rogers, and Ranking Member Pallone, and the members of the subcommittee for calling this important hearing and including me as a panelist. I am Michael O'Reilly, currently president of a self-named small consulting firm. Previously, I served as an FCC commissioner and a 20-year congressional staffer, including 8 years on this subcommittee. I want to start by extending my support for the large majority of bills and the underlying issues that are the subject of today's hearing. I appreciate and applaud the subcommittee's attention to ease the broadband permitting process and address the necessary component of pole attachments. In several instances, respectfully, I do believe the legislative efforts could go further, especially on pole attachments. For multiple decades, policymakers rightfully have declared it U.S. policy that all Americans should have access to broadband. Despite changing definitions of speed and capacity requirements over time, the charge has remained constant. Bring private sector broadband offerings to every unserved household in our nation. While several of today's bills may be being brought forward by Republicans, I note that relevant Biden administration officials have wholeheartedly agreed with permitting reform and have outlined additional action that they intend to take on that purpose. Inefficient and costly permitting and pole fee requirements extend broadband build-out timelines, raise overall cost, reduce willingness to participate in federal and state programs, alter bids being submitted, and waste broadband company resources. If the ultimate goal is to get broadband access to those unserved Americans, this effort, if sufficiently broad and comprehensive, can remove a known and legitimate set of obstacles to deployment. Likewise, the U.S. cannot be a global leader in wireless connectivity without necessary upgrades to the existing wireless infrastructure. Yet, creating modern wireless networks and meeting consumer wireless needs can requires overall approval from a multitude of government entities. In particular, the siting of towers and antennas, be they large or small, has generated unnecessary opposition from certain groups for various reasons, and operators have run into processes that are outdated, based outside of reason or fact, and are downright discriminatory. Application costs have also been a major issue. For wireline-centric networks, new fiber routes, as well as fiber connecting wireless communication towers and antennas, will be buried underground or attached to existing pole infrastructure. Hundreds of thousands of miles of fiber that all need to be approved, whether you use states or local lands, easements, rights-of-way, and the sorts, or needs overall governmental approval to dig and lay the fiber within a state. Thus, improvements to these procedures, such as those contained in the draft Broadband Leadership Act and other draft bills, would be exceptionally helpful to the effort. Respectfully, these are not new issues, as was mentioned before. They've been explored at length and are well known. I participated in hundreds and hundreds of meetings on this particular topic. I've been in the fields and have run the diggers, the cherry pickers, and the trenchers. I've had thousands of conversations with people who are trying to get broadband out into the communities they serve. I've sat with families who've not had broadband and are seeking it. And these problems exist and have existed pretty much in some form or fashion for the last 30 years of my career. We're finally getting to a point where we're trying to patch up a number of issues that are well known. On the wireless side, streamlining federal siting provisions and codifying recent efforts of the Commission, such as timelines, deemed granted procedures, application fee amounts, minimizing upgrade approval needed, and addressing historic preservation and NEPA restrictions would go a long way towards securing a wireless future and short-circuiting endless litigation. Additionally, a number of bills under consideration would address the wireless siting procedures on federal land. One of the bills being discussed today would effectively apply Section 224 of the Communications Act, thus sidestepping the current exemption for multiple municipal systems, cooperatives, and non-utilities for entities that are or becoming recipients of certain federal broadband subsidy programs. While I worry the scope of this bill may be too narrow, I'm outraged by a joint letter that I saw yesterday by many electric utility and co-op organizations opposing even this moderate step. To put in context, these organizations represent entities that have sought to enter the broadband marketplace and have full access to the provisions of 224 for areas outside their natural footprints, but reject any type of reciprocity. These are the same entities that stood at my door at the FCC and begged to be put first in line on broadband subsidies, leaving others to pick for the leftover areas and funds. Not only should this applicable bill be passed into law, but the current exemption should be completely eliminated. If that's too far, at least exclude the exemption for areas deemed unserved or underserved. I thank the chair for his time.
Well, thank you very much for your testimony. And before I begin the questioning on our end here with the members, I'd also like to point out that we also have another subcommittee running downstairs, health is, and so many of us also, including the chair, are also on health, and so we're going to have to go back and forth between the two subcommittees. But I just want to mention why you see the movement of members in and out of the subcommittee today. So it's not that they don't want to hear your testimony or be here for the entire, they're just covering for two, and it's always a fun day when we have three running, so we can really keep moving. But I'm going to begin the questioning and recognize myself for 5 minutes. And Mr. O'Reilly, as I've said, the infrastructure law was a missed opportunity to enact meaningful permitting reform. That's why we need to make those changes now. If Congress does not act to roll back certain permitting requirements, what are the risks to the future of broadband deployment in these hard-to-reach areas?
Thank you for the question. You're absolutely right that reform is necessary. The last time that I remember the Congress addressed these was in the citing provisions in 2012, last time I was here working in the Senate. If we don't go forward as a nation, if the subcommittee is unable to fix some of these issues, then broadband will be delayed. Broadband deployment will be extended, the timelines will be much farther out, and the costs will be exceptional for the providers themselves. And this is not something that we just learned of. We have providers in the RDOF program, the FCC's RDOF program, who are the canary in the coal mine, who have been trying this for a number of years to deploy and have run into these exact problems. It's not something that we just came up with. These things will delay deployment and cost more money, and that will leave a portion of population unserved after all the money has been spent.
Well, thank you. Mr. Saperstein, over the last decade, the FCC has taken a number of steps to streamline permitting for wireless infrastructure. These actions include imposing shot clocks for reviewing applications, deemed granted remedies for missing deadlines for reviewing applications to modify existing wireless towers, limiting fees. How have these changes helped accelerate deployment, and why should Congress codify these changes?
Thanks for your question, Mr. Chairman. So as you mentioned, thanks to Congress's leadership, starting really with the 6409 Act addition, the FCC has done a number of interpretations that have really made the siting process much more streamlined and efficient than it was before that. But the reason we need Congress's help is because those reforms are not necessarily permanent. As I mentioned, the proof is in the pudding in terms of the FCC's reforms and the overall improvements that we've seen. We've seen 5G deployed at a rate that 4G never was. We've seen twice as many, more infrastructure deployed over the last 2 years after the FCC's action than in the previous 7 combined. The FCC's interpretations of Congress's actions are making a big difference, but we're afraid if Congress does not step into act and does not codify the reforms that the FCC has made, that challenges like the one going on right now in the Ninth Circuit for the 5G upgrade order could backslide on all of those. And so we can't afford to have that. We can't afford to go back to where we were. We need to keep charging forward with our wireless infrastructure. So we appreciate your consideration.
Yeah, let me follow up, because again, something you mentioned, something I'm not sure I've ever heard here in committee, that you mentioned that, the problems that folks out there are finding, not only problems with shot clocks and things like that, but refusing to accept an application.
Yeah, I mean, and so this goes, I think, to part of.
And I guess one of the questions is how should we do that here in Congress to make sure that we're legislating on something like that? Because not accepting an application saying, sorry, we're not going to take it today or tomorrow or whenever.
Right. And some of the reforms that are proposed here, they provide accountability. And that's one of the key things that we seek. And that can be in the form of a deemed granted measure. So there's a certain shot clock. There are provisions in there for when an application is deemed complete. So it's clear to the jurisdiction as well as the applicant, you have submitted a complete application. There's an established period of review, which is appropriate. And from there, the jurisdiction either needs to act or the application would be deemed granted.
Oh, thank you. Mr. Romano, in my last minute and 10 seconds, a similar question for you. The FCC has taken some action to streamline wireline deployment, including one-touch make-ready rules and prohibiting moratoria on deployments. What reforms have not been acted upon by the FCC that Congress should consider to streamline the wireline permitting process? And I'm sorry, I only got about 50 seconds left.
So I'll just, thank you, Chairman, for the question. I think something like the Broadband Leadership Act is something we look to, for example, as a terrific measure to move some of these forward. They address some of the concerns that Mr. Saperstein raised as well in the wireless context. For example, when applications are considered complete, there's a definition in the bill of that process, received and complete, which is terrific. We've seen cases in Michigan, for example, where a provider didn't hear for months about the status of its application despite inquiries. These measures would help to instill, I think, definitional importance, definitional certainty in the process, promote communication, and ultimately, I think, lead to better results in terms of knowing where one stands at the very least in this process.
Well, I appreciate that. And again, what we want to get done, we want to make sure that our unserved areas get served. Our underserved areas get better service, and we don't end up in situations where you might have served areas being considered unserved. So these are all the things we're looking at. But my time's expired. At this time, I'm going to recognize the gentlelady from California, the ranking member of the subcommittee, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Last year, I wrote a letter to the Biden administration urging the Departments of Transportation and Energy, along with NTIA, to coordinate on the deployment of electric vehicle charging and broadband infrastructure. Much of the disparities we see in broadband access are also present in EV charging infrastructure. Low-income and rural areas lag behind. Co-locating EV charging and broadband infrastructure can address multiple national priorities simultaneously and avoid duplicative permitting requirements, maximizing impact of this funding. Mr. Saperstein, do you believe coordinating infrastructure deployment efforts in IIJA with broadband expansion can help reduce deployment barriers and stretch federal dollars further?
Thank you for the question. Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
One of WI's core tenets is to make shared use of infrastructure.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Saperstein. Much like Dig once, I really think this type of co-location can speed broadband deployment. I ask unanimous consent to have this letter introduced.
Without objection.
Okay. Mr. Falcone, this is a question for you. In addition to deployment challenges, we can't lose sight of the critical adoption and equity work we need to do to truly close the digital divide. I introduced the Digital Equity Foundation Act to establish a nonprofit foundation that would channel public and private investments into making progress boosting adoption and digital literacy. Mr. Falcone, can you discuss the role equity and adoption plays in closing the digital divide, and do you believe additional resources are needed to support these efforts?
Thank you for the question, Ranking Member Matsui. Absolutely. I think there is an awful lot of opportunity in helping a large segment of the population learn how to interface with the internet. A lot of them need actual assistance in understanding with the value of the internet, the resources available to them, and efforts that promote adoption are going to be necessary for quite a long time.
Okay. While it's understandable that federal agencies approach property management differently, significant discrepancies between their approaches to permitting can be extremely burdensome for broadband deployment on public lands. Mr. Saperstein, how do those diverse and conflicting requirements hinder broadband deployment on federal lands, and do you believe they have a disproportionate impact on rural broadband access?
Yes, I mean, when it comes to wireless infrastructure, the last remaining areas that are unserved by wireless are often in rural lands, and often those areas coincide with federal lands as well due to parkland. There are success stories. We know that some of our members have recently worked, for instance, in Utah to work closely to bring service there. But what we don't have right now when it comes to siting on federal lands is a clear sense of clarity for how the processes should exist, accountability, what happens if you miss the deadlines that Congress has worked so hard to install, and transparency. Where are we in the process? Even knowing that would be extremely helpful.
Okay, fine, thank you. Mr. Falcone, can you discuss how these arbitrary fee scales can disincentivize innovative broadband financial models?
Absolutely. So one of the things that fiber infrastructure provides from a financial planning standpoint is longevity. So you can look at it with a very long timetable of how long your investment will be worthwhile, and that opens up a lot of opportunities in terms of long-term financing. However, if there are fees that essentially, in my written testimony, I demonstrated a fee that kind of scaled up the cost of the monthly annual cost of deploying additional fiber strands, that kind of destroys the model of any sort of long-term planning. A lot of these will need on the early years, we'll need to look for subscribers and opportunities to sublease.
Okay, while permitting barriers can prevent deployment in certain circumstances, the biggest impediments have always been economic considerations. For rural and low-income neighborhoods, this historical legacy has produced a digital divide we're attempting to close with the BEAD program. Mr. Falcone, can you discuss the limitations of permitting reform in addressing these considerations and how BEAD can help support the access in these historically underserved areas? And I don't have much time. We have 30 seconds to discuss.
Certainly. So, I mean, the local community, the local government has always been the negotiating arm on behalf of the local community. So ensuring that they're part of the process to ensure that there's equitable deployment of the network and applicants is key.
I find that very true since I met with some of my people, and they feel the same way in these small villages and community areas. So anyway, thank you very much, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady is yielded back. The chair now recognizes the chair of the full committee, Ms. Rogers from Washington State.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The federal government owns a significant amount of land in the western states, hundreds of millions of acres, and many of these areas are unserved despite billions of dollars of private and public investment that has historically gone into broadband deployment. Mr. Romano and Mr. Saperstein, can you discuss the challenges your members face trying to deploy on federal lands and how we can make this process easier?
Sure. Thank you for the question, Chairwoman Rogers. To start, I think the issue on federal lands is getting, as Mr. Falcone mentioned as well, for fiber, for example, it's a long-term investment. We're trying to plan for years ahead and also trying to plan around build cycles and timeframes and seasons and the like. And the predictability is so important in trying to plan, especially for smaller providers, many of whom are based in rural America and want to serve the communities in which they live. Trying to plan to get contractors on site, trying to plan to get supplies in. All of these things are specific challenges that not only prevent potentially private deployment, but also can deter potential participation in public programs to the extent that I cannot necessarily specify when I'll be able to deliver, the cost of delivering. All of those things make it much harder to both deliver on the promise or even participate in the programs that would help with that.
Right, thank you. Mr. Saperstein, would you speak to maybe any ideas you have as to how we can make the process easier?
Yeah, we were excited to see two bills that dealt with portals, and this is a simple but easy, but really helpful fix that would at least allow applicants to know where they are in the process. Currently, there is no transparency into where they are from with the federal land agencies, so that would be a very helpful fix.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Finkel, I've heard from some providers that the cost of pole attachments is high and is a barrier to broadband deployment, and I understand that some pole attachment rates are regulated by the Federal Communications Commission, FCC, or the states, while some, those set by municipal or cooperatively owned utilities are not. I wanted to ask you to speak to how cooperatives determine their pole attachment rates and how they compare to the regulated rates.
Sure. So I appreciate the question, Madam Chair. Pole attachment rates, as determined by, at least I can only speak for electric cooperatives, is really based upon what the true cost is for that attachment. In many rural areas, there are more poles than people. And so when we're looking at what the cost is to attach to that pole, the cost is truly the cost. And there's no profit motive, though accusation has been made that we're in the business of trying to impose higher fees for excess. It's based on the geography, on the density, on the demographic of that community. And so when you're talking about trying to connect these rural communities, I mean, our members, they're the provider of last resort. They were in electricity 80 years ago, and they are now in many rural communities where they're providing that broadband service because nobody else will show up. I mean, so for us, reliability and affordability of the electric system is the first priority. And so when we try to establish that fee, it's a fee based upon what's going to keep that pole safe and what's going to ensure that we get back the true cost of that attachment.
Thank you for those insights. Appreciate what you do. I wanted to ask Mr. O'Reilly if you would also speak to this issue.
Yes, I appreciate the views of my fellow panelists, but I don't agree. We have providers that are right next to the exempt entities that are offering and able to comply with FCC rules and rates and are not going bankrupt and are not putting health and safety at risk. This exemption doesn't match up with costs. There's a number of studies that have been done that the rates are 2 to 3 times more expensive on the exempt entities than on non-exempt entities. And that's just not something a provider, we talk about areas that are unserved and why there's, a carrier of last resort or someone who's offering service. Well, Congress is going to is providing a boatload of money to help provide access and build out. It has to deal with the issue of these rates being, we're not going to bury all of the poles and fiber. We're going to have to attach to the poles that already exist.
Well, this is an issue that we're appreciate your insights. We got to work on this some more. In my time remaining, one of my priorities is to strengthen American competitiveness, and we know that the Chinese Communist Party wants to surpass us in wireless leadership, and it's easy for them to build the infrastructure to do that. We need to be doing everything in our power to make sure that that doesn't happen. So, why is permitting reform good overall for American competitiveness? And just incorporate that into your answers in the future. So, okay, thank you all for being here. I yield back.
The gentlelady is yielded. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from New York, Representative Clark, for 5 minutes.
Good morning. Let me start by thanking our panel of witnesses for joining us today, as well as Chairman Latta and Ranking Member Matsui for convening this important hearing on broadband deployment. Access to reliable, high-speed internet is essential in our increasingly digital society, and I'm proud of the work this committee has done to bridge the digital divide in America. The historic bipartisan infrastructure law provided billions of dollars in federal funding to bring high-speed internet to the millions of Americans still lacking access. As we continue to grow as a nation and expand our digital infrastructure, it is vital that these funds are used to bring broadband to communities historically left out of certain opportunities and investments. Unfortunately, the stark reality is that many of the communities that were disproportionately denied mortgage loans in the 1960s are the same communities that are without high speed or any internet access today. So I look forward to working with my colleagues on this committee to explore pathways to equitably streamline permitting processes, bridge the digital divide, and unleash the full potential of our nation. My first question is directed to Mr. Falcone. As this committee looks at efforts to streamline broadband deployment, what factors should we consider to ensure that low-income minority communities who have been subjected to both traditional and digital redlining in the past do not continue to be left behind? And other witnesses may feel free to chime in as well.
Certainly, thank you for that question. I think the fundamental goal of all of these applications and the funding is to ensure that the infrastructure is built equally and equitably to all people that are in need of it. The history of cherry picking and redlining has given Congress the reason to have passed the digital discrimination rulemaking. So ensure we don't forget that we had to do that, and prospectively going forward, ensuring equitable distribution of these networks is vital.
Would anyone else like to chime in there? Mr. Romano?
Thank you, Congressman. I'll weigh in as well, representing more rural areas specifically. I think one of the important things that Congress has done and that Congress should continue to do, and the funding agencies as well, is to make sure that when providers are receiving funding, for example, that there is a commitment to serve throughout the entirety of the area for which funding is provided without differentiation between particular communities within that serving area. I think that is a critical piece of this, and it does underpin, I think, a lot of the recent grant programs and other funding programs. But the accountability in the back end of tracking whether that is in fact happening is going to be critical as well.
Very well. Mr. Saperstein?
Yes, thank you for the question. I just wanted to point out that one of the great benefits of wireless infrastructure, particularly shared wireless infrastructure, is it allows multiple service providers to attach to the same facility, and therefore multiple network providers to serve that community. We saw the benefits of this with 99% coverage with 4G LTE, and we're already well on our way ahead of pace with 5G.
Very well, thank you. In your testimony, Mr. Falcone, you acknowledged that previous deregulatory efforts failed to spark industry competition and did nothing to mitigate the digital redlining we see today. I'd like to dig into that topic a bit more. Can you explain to this committee the negative impact of digital redlining, particularly how it perpetuates poverty in low-income and minority communities, and why haven't previous efforts by the FCC to streamline permitting for broadband deployment resulted in build-out in digitally redlined communities?
Certainly. So the natural inclination of a provider will be to kind of target the most lucrative portions of a community first. In the absence of any sort of regulation to ensure a fully distributed network, a full equitable deployment, that's generally where they'll stop. That's what most of these studies that we've seen over the years have shown. The markup did a nationwide analysis showing a replicated results of this type of discrimination that's occurring, and the ramifications that are significant. When we look at in terms of fiber deployment in particular, there's a study by the Fiber Broadband Association that shows that property values, the value of a home when it's connected to fiber, is a sizable. There's a sizable increase. So the equity of a household in a neighborhood is dependent on the wire that's connected to that household. The pandemic, I think, showed the significant problem when your connection couldn't handle distributed work and remote schooling. This is why I call it a first-class and second-class internet structure.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentlelady is yield back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Representative Bilirakis, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it very much, and I appreciate all the testimony here. I represent Pasco County, one of the counties that I represent, and it's no stranger to horrors of the federal permitting process. In 1998, the county identified the need for an additional emergency evacuation route for use during a flood event, such as a hurricane. That year, the county submitted its proposal known as the Ridge Road Extension Project to federal regulators. That public safety project sat in a regulatory quagmire for 22 years, despite the overwhelming support of the county residents and really unanimous support in the Tampa Bay area. Meanwhile, the 178,000 people who were deemed to benefit from the emergency project were put at risk. The project was finally green-lighted after President Trump issued an executive order titled Expediting Environmental Reviews and Approvals for High-Priority Infrastructure Projects. but we shouldn't have to rely on an executive order, folks, in my opinion, to streamline permitting, especially for projects that promote public safety. That's why I have submitted the Coastal Broadband Deployment Act as a discussion draft for today's hearing. This bill will remove lengthy barriers to deploying or modifying communication facilities within a floodplain, which can help people stay connected during a weather event. And I want to tell you, Ridge Road we finally got it done. And man, oh man, the people love it. The community loves it, and they feel safer because it is an evacuation route. God forbid we have a hurricane in our area directly. If we get a direct hit, it's going to be very difficult. But I want to ask the question, Mr. Romano, in your written testimony, you mentioned that your members have delays as long as the 2 years due to federal reviews when building out. Can you discuss the potential regulatory problems a company may face if they wanted to modify an existing communications facility, for example, to make it more resilient to natural disasters? If you could answer that question, I appreciate it.
Yes, thank you, Congressman, for the question. One of the most confounding deployment struggles we face at times is restoring networks, putting in where previously disturbed earth is there. You would think that putting a network back in or upgrading an existing network in a previously disturbed right-of-way should be relatively seamless due to the fact that it's already been used, and you would think that it's gone through reviews in the past. Nonetheless, we run into these circumstances all too frequently, and so I think bills like the one you've talked about are going to be critical to make sure that we can get through both the NEPA and the National Historic Preservation Act and Section 106 procedures as promptly as possible to re-engage or and then upgrade those networks in those places. The one other note I would make, Congressman, very quickly on this bill and a number of others is because they're amending existing law, they tie to 6409, which is a provision that's primarily dealing with wireless issues. So we would encourage the subcommittee and folks to think about this. I know there are some bills in here that help to amend 6409 to pick up wireline networks as well. And so we would like to make sure to see that as part of all of these measures to pick up wireless and wireline networks alike and make sure they're all resilient and can be restored quickly.
Very good. It makes a lot of sense to me. Mr. Saperstein, during an emergency, real-time communication keeps people informed of ongoing threats. Do you think there are instances where regulatory delays in building out or disaster mitigation of communications facilities could unnecessarily threaten lives through hindered communications?
Yes, and what we see right now is that much of the parklands, particularly in western districts, are still unserved, and that is really a public safety threat. So we would encourage any actions that can really expedite siting on federal lands in order to avoid those public safety instances.
Okay, I'd like to ask this question for Mr. O'Reilly. If we don't have time, at least he can get it for the record. Over the past several years, the federal government has allocated tens of billions of dollars of taxpayer money for broadband build-out and closing the digital divide, as you said. In your estimation as a percentage, how much of allocated dollars are doing regulatory red tape as opposed to actually getting people connected?
I'm happy to give you more specific, but if I had to, off the top, I would say it's probably around 15 to 20%.
Okay, that's a lot. So yeah, please, if you can give us some more specific information, I'd appreciate it. And I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
The gentleman is yielded back. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Representative Soto, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Just a few weeks ago, we got to travel to Kenansville, Florida, in our district in southern Osceola County with the Undersecretary of Rural Development, Xochitl Torres Small, a dear friend and former colleague here. We met with local ranchers and local hunting and game managers in an area that is as rural as it gets. And it was great to hear them talk about the $15 million being invested by the American Rescue Plan in that area. They talked about the need to download information quickly for their ranches, on information related to their cattle, on information related to dove hunting, who would have thought, right? The Osceola turkey as well, which you have to go to my district to make the turkey trot on the East Coast. And I guess if you're not in there, you don't realize how much data is needed for all these rural businesses and agricultural and hunting and other businesses. And so I was pleased to see that the American Rescue Plan is helping deliver internet to rural communities in Central Florida. And members, if you're not seeing that in your district, it's time to speak up. It's changing lives in Central Florida. But that's just the first step. And we know with the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act passed recently, $65 billion to improve internet access, $42 billion for the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, the BEAD program. I'm excited that Florida has taken steps to participate in the BEAD program and signaled intends to continue that process. We already saw $5 million awarded to help with their initial planning grant to create a 5-year action plan, and they've received over $7.4 million in federal funds to support that planning. In addition, NTIA has estimated, as well as third-party research, that Florida could receive as much as $1.5 billion through BEAD to really help finish the job across Florida. The company in question who stepped up for areas of South Osceola was Spectrum. And Mr. Romano, are your member companies ready to take on this challenge like we've seen in rural Osceola?
Thank you, Congressman. Yes, they're ready and eager. I think the biggest challenge, some of the biggest challenges will be figuring out, well, among other things that aren't subject to this hearing necessarily, supply chain considerations, finding trained workforce. But the permitting issues, again, will be a piece of the puzzle. Our members have been, actually, I would say, probably the most active participants in the Reconnect program, so great partners with rural development. I think we're excited about the promise of this. The biggest concern I have right now is, as I mentioned in my testimony, we're on the precipice of massive amounts of investment coming in, and we need to make sure both the procedures are ready to go, but also the staff skill sets and training are there, and the systems to make sure, as Mr. Saperstein mentioned, the portals, to make sure that we can realize the promise of all of these different programs out there.
Thank you. And Mr. Finkel, this is Peace River country, one of your members, and I know they've been eager since we'll see a combination of companies help with this. How are your members gearing up, and what are you hearing from your customers about the potential of getting higher speed internet?
Well, Congressman, it's always driven by the local community, as electric utilities owned by the communities we serve. When the community speaks up and our kind of ownership base drives us to build out and asks us to partner, we do. It's just really that simple.
Well, we're excited to work with our local folks as well. Mr. Falcone, we saw the Biden-Harris administration put out a permitting action plan. There's a lot of discussion in the cornucopia of bills up today in this hearing of how to address permitting as we implement the Inflation Reduction Act and the infrastructure law. Do you have any comments on the permitting action plan by the Biden-Harris administration and any other principles that you think can guide us as we have to permit these projects?
Yeah, I think it just demonstrates that everyone's committed to the success of implementation of BEAD. No one wins if systemic delays results in rising costs, particularly for small applicants, particularly new entrants into the space. I think, as I say in my written testimony, really just predictability and predictability in the cost in terms of the fees on public lands are probably the two best things you can deliver in order to ensure successful outcomes.
Thank you so much. Members, our oversight is going to be a key part of this as well as we work with the administration, with our colleagues in Congress. So look forward to continuing that work. And I yield back.
Okay. Thank you. The gentleman yields back, and this time the chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan's 5th District for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the panel for being here. Broadband providers are subject to significant permitting delays, as we've talked about already. Delays are felt by the consumers, the frustration of some of my neighbors seeing me with broadband finally and not seeing themselves with a sight of broadband coming down. I felt the same way for a number of years myself. And so it's a challenge. Connecting everyone to broadband is a goal we all share. Billions of dollars have gone out the door, but it takes dollars, it takes many hands to make it work, and oftentimes we don't see interagency coordination. And maybe through no fault of their own, but the process that takes place. The FCC, NTIA, USDA, and various stimulus grants over the years have often appeared to compete with one another. And so, Mr. Romano, how do we improve coordination between agencies? And if I could add on to that question, do you believe requiring all government broadband programs to make distributions based on FCC's new broadband maps can break the decades-long cycle of overbuilding and the problems that come from that?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. The second part of your question, actually, I think was the first place I was going to go in terms of effective coordination, which is the use of a singular data source to start from. Now, there are always going to be issues arising in terms of the maps that are produced by the FCC being snapshots in time and needing updating. There are processes set forth in BEAD, for example, for states to run challenges. But at the end of the day, we should be starting from a singular data source that reflects the best source of information we've got available. So I think that is going to be a critical starting point for coordination. The other part of coordination that's going to be important is sharing of information about enforceable commitments that are made, grants that are made among these agencies, so that if NTIA sees that the FCC has done something over here, NTIA is not necessarily putting money there or vice versa. So I think that sharing of information about enforceable commitments feeding into the broadband mapping exercise, those are two of the most critical pieces of communication that can happen.
And cuts down a lot of waste, too. Yeah. Mr. Saperstein, while permitting delays can be a barrier to deployment, should we also be concerned about other potential bottlenecks, including supply chain delays, workforce shortages, and what efforts are underway to ensure we have the labor force in place to get the job done?
Congressman, thank you for the question. WIA actually is doing a lot on the workforce front. We are a partner with the Department of Labor with the Telecommunications Industry Registered Apprenticeship Program, which has thousands of apprentices in the pipeline now working with over 80 employers. We couldn't agree more that we can't allow our human workforce, our human infrastructure to become a bottleneck here, and so we're working to train the next generation.
Yeah, so necessary. Good jobs out there, too.
Yeah, absolutely.
The slate of bills we're discussing today includes my Brownfields Broadband Deployment Act, which would help streamline the deployment of broadband projects entirely within brownfield sites by eliminating the requirement to prepare an environmental or historic preservation review. These sites are often located in digitally underserved areas, and the proposed changes will help promote greater digital connectivity. In Vicksburg, Michigan, where it was just last week, in fact, they're creating a one-of-a-kind facility for lodging, entertainment, artist development in a town of less than 4,000. Located in a former paper mill, this brownfield site will hopefully bring incredible economic growth to the area, but they have a problem with connection. Mr. Romano, how important is broadband connection to the economic viability of rural areas, and how could a longer regulatory approval process for broadband infrastructure destroy that opportunity?
Thank you, Congressman. So at NTCA, we believe not only that networks need to be built, but they need to be used and celebrated, and that those the best practices should be shared. I mean, economic development, we have a program called Smart Rural Community that highlights the fact that these networks are not just built for their own sake, but for the benefit ultimately and uses of the community for telehealth, telework, economic development, and the like. Those types of uses, especially in a town of 4,000 people, that's about the average size of the biggest city in the type of areas that our members serve. That's a difference maker in terms of attracting new people to rural areas and just getting people to come back home after school. So it's incredibly important, and permitting is a big part of that. If providers go to, again, as I said earlier, in an earlier question, if it takes them, if they look at a program and think, I could do this, but for the fact that I don't know that I can meet the build-out deadlines because I don't even know when my shot clock's going to start, that can be a real deterrent to participation.
Yeah, and this is a visionary community. They believe in their community. It's a neat site. It'll be unbelievable if they get it done, but this is a key component to it. So thanks for your attention, and I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back, and this time the chair recognizes 5 minutes the ranking member of the full committee, the gentleman from New Jersey, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Latta. Affordable, reliable broadband service is a resource that every community needs and every community wants, and so I have some concern that broad measures by Congress to trample on local authority and treat every community the same will end up creating more problems than they solve. So let me start with Mr. Falcone. In your testimony, you point to examples of when past deregulation efforts have not closed the digital divide, but have in fact exacerbated the problem. So what lessons should we keep in mind about the role of municipalities and local leaders in broadband deployment? And how can proposals to remove local consultation and authority hinder efforts to connect all Americans to high-speed internet?
Thank you for that question, Ranking Member Pallone. I think the big lesson to have learned is just looking at the results of what has happened when you compare two similarly situated markets, Los Angeles and New York City. New York retained local authority for franchising, and California did it. California consolidated under the state government. New York is pushing fiber to the home to hundreds of thousands of low-income households, New York City that is, and Los Angeles has less than half of their community connected to 21st century access today. You know, these are both very similar areas of density in terms of income and opportunity, business sector, but the removal of the local community from negotiating with the ISPs, from ensuring equity in the deployment, ensuring a ubiquitous deployment, yields these results. So I think that is the number one lesson to learn from removing local power, removing the local community from the equation, and working with ISPs. They're eager to work, but they also want to make sure everyone is covered.
All right. Now, many of the witnesses today have pointed to a lack of resources at permitting agencies as a cause for delay and other challenges in the review process. But again, Mr. Falcone, what is the risk to communities and the public at large if we ignore those resource constraints and focus only on strict approval timelines and deemed granted provisions, if you will?
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. The challenge here that we're facing is this is the largest public works projects happening in many areas for decades, and they don't have the staffing in place to handle that. So staffing up and providing the personnel resources to review these permits in an expeditious way resolves the issue. It's not really about removing the government or getting the government out of the equation. The government is an inherent and necessary partner for the success of the deployment of these areas. The ISPs cannot completely go it alone to be successful at their deployment plans.
So would you agree then that unless permitting agencies at the federal, state, local, or tribal levels get additional resources for personnel and training, we're not going to fully address delays in permitting for broadband infrastructure?
I think there's a whole list of unforeseeable complications that will come up when, particularly for, and I would like to distinguish between, upgrading areas where existing rights were already utilized versus new construction. A lot of this money is going towards new construction in new areas, lacking knowledge of the local area because the managing government agency is the one with that knowledge could be detrimental to deployment planning.
All right, thanks. I just get in a question or so to Mr. O'Reilly. It's good to see you here today. I'm concerned that efforts to complete our historic build-out of reliable high-speed broadband to every corner of the country will still leave too many people behind unless we continue to focus on ensuring that everyone can afford the service, regardless of income. So I know that I'm sure you can answer, or if you could just briefly discuss funding for the Affordable Connectivity Program, why it's important to close the opportunity gap. So I know because you've been involved with it, obviously.
I have supported and do support the ACP. I believe that additional funding from Congress will be wisely spent. Affordability is a component for a number of American families who, we can get broadband to everybody, but if they can't afford it, then they're not going to be able to subscribe. The program is working today. It's probably in the best program in terms of its structure that we've had. And there have been a number of programs in the past that have had deficiencies, and we've solved some of those with ACP. So I think additional funding would be appropriate, but that's also with another committee to work through in terms of going forward.
Well, we can push them, as you know.
I think that'd be smart for both sides, and I support it. As a fiscal conservative, I think it's money well spent.
All right, thank you so much. I guess I'm out of time, so I'll leave it at that. Thanks a lot. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you very much. The gentleman yields back. And this time, the chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, the vice chair of the subcommittee, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you for being here. Before I ask my questions, I want to respond to the ranking member's comments earlier about broadband permitting barriers not existing. I could not disagree more. They do exist, and The witnesses here today have already cited examples of where they exist, and I'm sure we'll cite even more examples. Even the current FCC chairwoman has also acknowledged that these barriers exist. In 2018, when the Republican-led FCC embarked on an effort to revise its infrastructure rules to promote expansion of 5G, Chairwoman Rosenwalter suggested in her statement that, quote, if we want broad economic growth and widespread mobile opportunity, we need to avoid unnecessary delays in the state and local approval process, unquote. While we may disagree on the approach, we must all acknowledge that these are real problems and they deserve real solutions. So I appreciate you bringing up these examples that you've brought up. And with all due respect, I am encouraged to hear the ranking member say that he's concerned about local control, a long-held Republican view that I'm glad that is being shared now with some of our colleagues. So I appreciate that. You know, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate this hearing because this is extremely important. And as vice chair of this committee, it's one of the things that I really wanted to concentrate on. And one of my top priorities is to close the digital divide that exists, particularly in rural America. For those of you who don't know, I'm from Georgia. As we have a saying in Georgia, there are two Georgias. There's Atlanta and everywhere else. And I represent everywhere else. So this is extremely important to me. And it's extremely important for us to continue to lead U.S., to help the U.S. maintain leadership on broadband and wireless innovation, investment, and competition. So, Mr. Saperstein, I want to ask you, one of the bills that we're discussing today is my bill, the Proportional Reviews for Broadband Development Act. This expedites the process for certain modifications to wireless towers or base stations. Specifically, it exempts the addition, removal, or replacement of transmission equipment on those towers or stations from environmental and historic preservation reviews. Do you think that such a simple modification would improve the quality and the timeliness of broadband deployment for Americans?
Yes, thank you for the question. So, yes, I mean, I think what your bill and what we're seeing with many of the bills affecting the NEPA review is that it adds a deal of proportionality to the review at stake. So not everything needs to be reviewed in the same manner. Co-locations don't need to be reviewed in the same manner. Things that have already undergone different reviews don't need to be reviewed in the same manner. And I think it brings a common sense approach to that.
Thank you, and that's the key, common sense, and that's what we're trying to get at here. Look, we all want to make sure we have rules and regulations that are followed, but we want to use common sense and get this done. And really eliminate unnecessary barriers. That's what we're all trying to do here. Also, Mr. Saperstein, I wanted to ask you, in June of 2021, the New Jersey State Assembly passed S. 2674, a bill that was led by 3 Democrats that would institute cost-based fees, shot clocks, and deem grant remedies for wireless and broadband network facilities. The purpose of the bill was to meet the growing consumer demand for wireless data and increasing competitive options for communication services available to the state's residents. Chairman Latta has a bill that the Wireless Leadership Act that contains many of the same principles as this New Jersey state bill. Do you agree that enacting these policies would help meet the needs of consumers and promote competition?
Yes. We appreciate Chairman Latta's Wireless Leadership Act and its steps that it would take to really codify many of the reforms that the FCC has done to encourage fees that are reasonably based to the costs, as well as streamlining of permitting procedures.
Good. The New Jersey bill that passed the state Senate was also amended to accommodate the concerns of residents and municipal leaders who raise concerns. Can you describe how broadband permitting laws can balance state and local concerns with the need for timely and fair permitting processing?
Absolutely. One of the things that we've seen is that we've taken out the review of co-location, which makes sense because it's making use of existing infrastructure. There's nothing in what we see here today that would remove a community's ability to have legitimate aesthetic concerns and their own processes dealt with. So there's a good balance to be struck in there, and we find that we have a good partnership with our communities.
Great. Thank you, and thank all of you for being here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll yield back.
Well, thank you very much. And our next member to ask questions is the gentlelady from New Hampshire. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for being with us today to discuss how to speed up deployment of broadband services. There are a number of legislative proposals before us today, but I'd like to take a step back and further examine the challenges to broadband deployment. Addressing these challenges will allow states and providers to implement federal broadband funding. Through the bipartisan infrastructure law, Congress invested in historic $65 billion to build out our country's broadband infrastructure. This established the Broadband Equity, Access, and Deployment Program for states to expand high-speed services to their communities. This program will ensure that even the most rural and hard-to-reach communities, like many in my district in New Hampshire, have access to broadband. Mr. Falcon, you spoke about how deploying this scale of infrastructure will be a major endeavor for many small communities. How should Congress ensure local governments are equipped to meet this challenge?
Thank you for that question. What it boils down to is providing the resources for personnel to kind of meet this surge of demand. This is going to be a very intense but short period of years where these projects will come in large volume, and once constructed, given that the guidance is to deploy fiber, we will not be revisiting these anytime in the near future. So it's really just a matter of the surge of demand and ensuring the resources are available there for them to meet that demand when it comes.
Thank you. Now, I know that local governments will play an important role in bringing high-speed broadband service to the communities. While this hearing focuses on the deployment of broadband, these services will still be out of reach for families that can't afford them. The Affordable Connectivity Program, or ACP, is established by the bipartisan infrastructure law to provide assistance to eligible households to help them afford internet services. This program has already connected over 16 million Americans to internet services, including many, many families in my district. Unfortunately, funding for the ACP is set to run out without congressional action. Mr. O'Reilly, you briefly spoke about the importance of addressing broadband affordability. Can you elaborate on why funding the ACP should be a high priority this Congress?
So as I mentioned to the ranking member of the full committee, I do support ACP. I believe it's important to address affordability component. There are a number of families in America, certainly in New Hampshire, that won't be able to afford service without such a program. I think we crossed the 17 million threshold in terms of people, families that are taking advantage of the funding. So I think it is something that has to be addressed if you're trying to figure out how to serve all Americans. If I could just return briefly to your previous question. Sure. I've spent a great deal of time in New Hampshire in past life. I will tell you the local governments there are really sharp. And I don't know that they need necessarily the resources. It's really the areas, especially in the North Country and the western part that you represent, that attracting, having the subsidy that's going to come forward to actually serve those areas throughout. That's probably more important to me in terms of New Hampshire, in terms of the local governments who are actually pretty, they're very small and they do represent the people very well.
Well, we're lucky we have a lot of volunteers that get involved in these committees who are very knowledgeable. As co-chair of the Rural Broadband Caucus, I'm committed to ensuring that communities can connect to broadband services. It's critical that Congress not only address the challenges to deploying broadband, but also work to make these services more affordable. The bipartisan infrastructure law set our country on a path to close the digital divide, and I look forward to working with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to continue this work. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back with 49 seconds.
Would the generally yield?
I will yield.
Hey, thanks very much. I'd like to go back with the 40 seconds that were remaining. A question, just a quick question. Mr. Finkel, in your statement, you mentioned that with right-of-ways on federal lands that when you already have the lines up, that you have to renegotiate for the broadband. I assume you're deploying a line across it, and so what's the difference? This is the common sense question.
Yes.
It's already there, and you're putting another line up.
So many rural electric cooperatives are either crisscrossing or abutting federal lands, whether it's U.S. Forest Service, BLM, and so we'll have existing electric infrastructure, and we'll have existing right-of-way and existing easement. And to put up broadband onto the same pole in the same right-of-way with the same easement requires a greenfield review in many cases.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure I had that clarified. Thank you very much. And I appreciate the gentlelady yielding. The gentleman from Florida's 2nd District is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Lotta. So as he said, coming from the 2nd District of Florida, we know how damaging natural disasters such as hurricanes can be to communications infrastructure when it matters the most. You know, communications facilities, including wireless and wired infrastructure and power sources, shelters, et cetera, they're all essential after a disaster and must be restored quickly, efficiently. That's why I plan on reintroducing my bill, the Connecting Communities Post-Disasters Act of 2023. My bill provides that after a major disaster declared by the President, projects to replace and improve communications facilities will not be subject to the requirements to prepare environmental historical preservation reviews, which become massive obstructions. You know, this requirement leads to needless delays, and it happens during a crisis when it's most essential to restore these services. You know, when your community is damaged by natural disaster and it's struggling for essential communications infrastructure, imagine the frustration, the barriers such as a mandatory environmental preservation review, you know, can cause. These are reviews that were performed previously when the infrastructure was first built. I think it's nonsense red tape. We've addressed that earlier. It must be corrected, and for the good of relieving all Americans. Mr. Saperstein, in your testimony, you mentioned that Congress has made progress on removing barriers to the wireless infrastructure in the past, and yet broadband is still out of reach for far too many people. Do you agree that wireless connectivity is especially important during and immediately after natural disasters?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. Yes, I mean, I think the first place most people reach in order to get in touch with their loved ones is to their cell phone, and so they can reach out and make that connection. So wireless connectivity is absolutely a key, and your bill makes a number of common sense points with respect to NEPA reform.
I experienced that firsthand after Hurricane Michael. We went 13 days without our cell phones. So you can imagine, you know, several counties like that. We were really wandering around lost. So both baseline connectivity and, of course, resilience and restoration after disaster is very important. Are you familiar, sir, with any regulatory barriers to wireless deployment specifically when recovering from natural disasters?
So when it comes to natural disasters, the physical infrastructure is generally pretty resilient. What happens is we often lose power, and that's one of the key elements that we need to make the overall systems run. There's backup power, but that only exists so long, and you know the providers themselves are not independent sources of commercial power. So that's one of the reforms that we really need to see overall.
Yeah, our problem is we lost all our towers. I certainly agree with the need for resilient infrastructure, and I encourage all my colleagues to support this legislation in order to increase our nation's ability to respond and rebuild after disasters. Mr. Romano, as EVP of the Rural Broadband Association, I'm especially happy to see you here. Can you share with us what the biggest regulatory burdens, challenges, or inefficiencies are impacting wired connectivity in rural areas?
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. Yes, so fundamentally making the business case to invest in rural areas where distances are measured in tens or hundreds of miles and densities are very low, that is a significant issue. And obtaining permits in order to deploy across those areas can be a significant barrier, as I've talked about. In particular, I think things that we see frequently, and I mentioned briefly in a question earlier, replacing, so our members have been in these communities in many cases for decades, or hundreds of years, or 100 years in some cases. But the problem becomes replacing or upgrading networks in these existing facilities, or restoring in the case of natural disasters. We have to go through oftentimes repeat reviews under National Historical Preservation Act, Section 106, or NEPA. The ability to make sure we can upgrade these networks in an efficient fashion to get better broadband out there, more resilient broadband out there, bury the networks if we need to, that's a significant regulatory impediment today.
Well, thank you very much for that. I'll take that as an endorsement of my bill. It's an important, thing for us to streamline the connectivity development and restoration in the United States. I just want us to stay out of our own way, with excess permitting needs. And so I think if we do that, we can help everyone in the United States. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back, and at this time, the chair recognizes the gentleman from California's 29th District for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and also thank you, Ranking Member Matsui, for having this important hearing on broadband. As we all know, in November of 2021, President Biden signed the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act into law. Through this legislation, Congress made a $65 billion investment towards eliminating the digital divide and delivering affordable, reliable, high-speed broadband to every American. In the next few months, the NTIA will begin providing grants to states and territories to deliver broadband access to underserved areas across our nation. While this is truly a historic investment in our country's infrastructure, Congress's work still is not done. Affordable broadband to every American is far from over. We have a lot of work to do. Specifically, there are various permitting application and review processes that must take place before broadband can be deployed effectively. Some of my colleagues are highly skeptical of the value of these processes. I, on the other hand, believe that these processes are important to keeping communities safe, competition robust, and ensuring that important stakeholders are not ignored. That having been said, permitting should not be overly burdensome. Construction of these critical projects should not be delayed by endless reviews or unreasonable fees. We must strike a balance between protecting communities and expanding and improving broadband in an efficient and cost-effective manner. Mr. Falcón, in your testimony, you gave an example of how policies in New York yielded more equitable results and brought more fiber to homes, more than my little hamlet of Los Angeles in the 2000s, using the quote from one of my colleagues as she described hamlets in her district. So I felt a little jealous. So can you provide, it sounds cozy, can you provide other more recent examples of state or local governments that can serve as models for expanding high-quality, reliable broadband access to their residents?
Certainly. So, as I mentioned before, the local government is I would say a valuable partner to the industry because of the rights of way the taxpayers funded the infrastructure that allows these networks to deploy. I think one of the best examples from California is Brentwood, California. In Brentwood, California, the city required developers to build conduit and deed it to the city. So a large underground conduit network was available for a competitive fiber provider called Sonic to deploy what I would say is probably the fastest, cheapest private internet, $40 for 1 gigabit, $50 for 10 gigabit internet. That was really a product of smart local planning and coordination with the local government to really eliminate the most expensive part of construction, which is the civil works in deployment. I think if more communities made their rights of way accessible and kind of pre-planned for the advent of new entrants coming in, that pays itself off quite handsomely as these applicants are coming in.
Okay. Also, Mr. Falcón, a lot of your work and that of your organization is focused on connecting historically underserved and underprivileged communities with modern high-speed broadband. Can you talk about the importance of the Affordable Connectivity Program now and into the future in meeting our goal of universal connectivity, and how would a permanent affordability program level the playing field between high and low-income communities competing for providers to serve them?
Thank you for that question, Congressman. The ACP, if it were to be made permanent, I think would radically change the financial planning of many providers that are motivated to serve entire communities. One of the first things I started asking a lot of the people in the kind of the public and the private industry when ACP was first enacted is how much does this change the way you think about where you can deploy and finance it? And the answer was not enough because it was temporary. We want to have 10 to 30 year, maybe even 40-year plans, and if this money runs out within 5 to 6 years, we really don't make a plan around that. We don't really expect a revenue source from low-income subsidies as a means of helping finance the overall network. But if Congress were to make the ACP permanent, I think you would see a lot more expansion of these networks simply because the predictability and the dependability of the revenue and how you would change the attractiveness of low-income users to many in the industry would be significant.
So are you describing that a longer plan would actually spur public-private participation to bring more accessibility to more Americans?
A permanent ACP would, I think, expand private providers and public providers and all players, cooperatives as well, their capacity to deploy fiber simply because the dependability of the revenue for parties who can't afford the internet will be there, and that changes a lot of financial models.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back, and the chair recognizes the gentleman from Utah for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Ranking Member, thank you for holding this hearing. I find myself, as I'm listening to this, thinking, I think we all agree on this. Like, why can't we move forward? Why can't we solve this? And I also feel like there's a little bit of one-upmanship, and I'm going to try to do one-upmanship over all my colleagues today and see if any of them can beat me on this. Think about this scenario. My district is not only rural, half of it is classified as frontier. Now layer over the top of that, the vast majority of it, 90% of the land is owned by the federal government. Now wrap your arms around that for a minute when we talk about these delays. 90% of this property, it takes years and years and years to permit. A great story is one of my companies had to spend the money within 5 years. The permit took 9 years to go, Mr. Chairman, in an existing right-of-way, down an existing road to lay that fiber, 9 years. And we want to solve this, much quicker than that. So I have a bill out there. It's the Rural Broadband Permitting Efficiency Act. And what this basically does is it turns over NEPA to the states. We do this in transportation a lot, where we let the states complete the NEPA process for the federal government. Federal government's backed up. We know it takes them years and years to get an answer. It's a great bill. It actually passed on a bipartisan basis in the 115th Congress, and I'd like to commend this bill to my colleagues as one possible solution to help us move through this. Mr. Finkel, just weigh in on the impact of 9 years to permit. What is that costing us, right? Help us get our arms around that.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about, depending on the size and scale of the project, I mean, 10, 20, 30% more. And especially in a time where we have a constrained supply chain. So you have federal dollars. The federal dollars are going to expire at some point. So you don't have BEAD out there yet, right? So if you have 9 years to permit the project, and the BEAD money is going to expire in 9 years, you're not going to get the project built. And even if you do, it's going to push you off 5, 6, 7 years, where your costs are going to go up. So your original cost estimates are going to be up considerably between now and then. And that's even when you try to do it in an existing right-of-way.
So now we can understand that from a company's perspective. Imagine the constituents we're trying to serve and telling them you have to wait 9 years, right, before you can have this. Mr. Saperstein, weigh in from your member's perspective. If we were able to fix this, what would your members be able to do differently, right, if they didn't have this? That we're all talking about, all of us are talking about the same problem here. Can you give us what that world looks like?
Well, the world is universal connectivity. I mean, I think that's the short answer, where people can use their devices and be connected anywhere they go at any point, enabling the world and economy to their homes and phones.
So I've only got just a couple minutes, and so I'm going to direct this to you and Mr. Romero and Mr. O'Reilly. Last August, NTIA and Bureau of Indian Affairs announced an agreement to, among other things, streamline the NTIA and Bureau of Indian Affairs Environmental Policy Act reviews for tribal broadband grants. In fact, Assistant Secretary Alan Davidson noted pridefully that NITA is, quote, streamlining the creating efficiencies within the federal government to ensure tribal communities get the resources they need quickly to close the digital divide on tribal lands. I believe a lot of the Republican-led legislation that's being discussed today would streamline the environmental review process. And I'm just wondering if, I also think that's consistent with President Biden's approach. Can any of you describe the impact of this, and is this part of the answer?
So, yes, thank you for the question. So streamlining and efficiency are two favorite words when it comes to permitting processes. And for too long, many things, particularly on federal lands, have been caught up in those.
Yeah, Mr. Rivera.
And I would just say, yes, extending it or offering that up in that program is, I think, a good case study for why it makes sense in other programs. And I must tell you, one of the most frustrating things we see is when members get grant awards, announce that a grant award's been won, and the customer's still waiting years later for that big news release they saw in the local paper that broadband's coming. So yes, absolutely.
So we use the word coordination. I would suggest that it is, as nice as the presentation sounded, that Congress acting on the matters that are before it today and others, and including one that you mentioned, would be very helpful. The coordination is great, and the conversations will happen between the different parties and NTIA and the Bureau of Indian Affairs, but actually getting progress is a different story.
Yeah, I'm out of time, but I'd like to urge all my colleagues, and myself included, to make this a priority and move these bills that we seem to all agree on, and let's see if we can solve this. Mr. Chairman, I yield my time.
Well, thank you. The gentleman yields back, and this time the chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas 33rd District, 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And want to also say, this is great, the historic and bipartisan Infrastructure and Investment Job Acts. We're delivering on a promise to create a more digitally inclusive and equal society. And I continue to hear stories all over Dallas-Fort Worth about helping to bridge the digital divide. We have neighborhoods now, lower income neighborhoods, that have free access to Wi-Fi so kids can do homework and people can start businesses. And the Affordable Connectivity Program, or the ACP, is also another success story that highlights the benefits of making broadband internet affordable for low-income households. And after California, Texas, and Florida have the highest ACP enrollment rates in the country. And I think Commissioner O'Reilly put it well in his recent op-ed, and it said American poverty is not isolated to urban areas, but distributed throughout our country. In blue areas and red areas, the opportunity gap resulting from unequal broadband access really impacts all regions. American families from all walks of life are connecting to high-speed, reliable, and affordable broadband internet at unprecedented levels. And for instance, in the chairman's district in Ohio, close to 50,000 households are enrolled in the ACP. The title of today's hearing is Breaking Barriers, Streamlining Permitting to Expedite Broadband Deployment. But I would also urge my colleagues to engage in a conversation about the sustainability of ACP, which is targeted to help eligible households afford broadband once it's deployed. And I hope this is an issue that we can work on together, because it's obviously something that's helping all of our districts. My question, Commissioner O'Reilly, in the op-ed that you wrote, you said more broadband deployment does not necessarily equate to greater adoption. Broadband will remain inaccessible to poorer families if affordability is ignored. And I couldn't agree with you more. You urged Congress to prioritize extending ACP by adding additional funds. Can you elaborate on why you think it is so important for Congress to get to work on extending the program, which is likely to deplete mid-next year, if not sooner?
That's right. Mid-next year sounds about where the estimates are. And I just correct one point earlier. I think the program actually is authorized. It's we talked about permanency. I think it exists. It's really a question of the funding.
Right.
Yes, sir. I think it's a question of funding.
Funding, right, exactly.
And then that's something to be addressed. But to your point, I think there's a portion of American families that will all be challenged by the budgets that they face and the circumstances they face, and it's both in urban centers and also in very rural America. That the jobs, and depending on the economic situations that they face, that they're going to not be able to afford broadband. And if we believe, and I do, and in my previous jobs believe the benefits of broadband and should be available to all Americans, well, then we have to address something on the affordability side. And I think ACP is structured the best that that Congress and the government has created an affordable program. Others have had lacking. There's still some improvements to be had here. Can address some waste, fraud, and abuse in the program. May look at eligibility, but overall, ACP is the best we've had, and I'd like to see Congress add some funds to it.
Yeah, in your op-ed, you also talked about the positive externalities of broadband adoption with respect to helping government operate more efficiently and generating economic activity. Can you expand on that and describe the negative impacts that the loss of ACP would have on families that rely on it, and on businesses and local communities if families are suddenly no longer able to afford broadband service.
Oh, absolutely. Broadband and accessibility and affordability. Having broadband, reduces the cost for government. There's just so many services that would no longer need to be in a paper form. Will be in, you can reduce populations in terms of in DC. You can, scatter offices. You can do all kinds of different things that are more efficient. And can reduce the cost for government services, but it's on the small business side. It's in bringing options and opportunity to so many different families that don't have it today in terms of services that they may have, or to be able to access to retail and so many different things that they just don't have in their local communities and the supplies and and the job side of the equation. I've been and sat in families' kitchens when they're trying to figure out how do they their job's moving away. And the employer says, you can work remotely, and they say, I don't have broadband, what do I do?
Yeah. No, thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. At this time, the chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Latta and Ranking Member Matsui, for holding today's hearing. And thanks to the witnesses for offering your time, your expertise, and your testimony. Americans have increasingly turned to the internet for work, for school, for agriculture, for socialization, and in telehealth. Virtually every facet of our daily lives requires fast and reliable access to this commodity. As members of this body, it is incumbent upon us to provide for our constituents and all Americans access to resources specific to this conversation, high-speed internet. However, something that seems so simple and fundamental is often met with opposition and prolonged delays, especially with regard to build-out and permitting for this necessary infrastructure. In an effort to bridge this digital divide, I have led legislation that would cut through the bureaucratic red tape and streamline the permitting process in order to speed up the deployment of critical broadband infrastructure. As Chair McMorris Rogers stated earlier in this hearing, rural America cannot left behind. Rural America should not be left behind. In the 21st century, connectivity is actually a key for success, and securing better access to broadband, especially in rural Pennsylvanian communities, will benefit students, small businesses, farmers, seniors, families. So let's start with our questions. Mr. Saperstein, when you've had positive interactions with state and local permitting office, what were those experiences like? And can other similar offices learn from your experiences?
Yes, and thank you for the question, Congressman. So many communities now recognize the intense value that comes with mobile connectivity and wireless connectivity. And so many of the relationships that we have with our communities across the country are in fact positive. The reforms that we're seeking today are to make sure that those reforms stay in place nationwide. When we have positive interactions, we are respectful of the community, recognizing their need to have a say in the siting process, but also recognizing that these facilities need to be built to ensure coverage everywhere.
What specific steps should we take, Mr. Saperstein, can Congress use to reduce costs to broadband providers when deploying new networks?
So co-location has been one of the biggest benefits of the overall congressional reforms. And the reforms that have streamlined that process have paid off by expedited siting and increased wireless coverage everywhere. Making permanent the FCC's interpretations of congressional acts is probably the single most important thing that you could do.
So the permanency will lower cost?
Correct.
Thank you. Mr. Romano, in some regions of our country, and particularly in rural areas like I represent in Pennsylvania, construction can only occur when the weather permits. How have long application review wait times or environmental or historic preservation reviews delayed your ability to deploy broadband in areas where the construction period might only be 5 or 6 months out of 12?
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. Yes, and the frost belt can be a real concern for people, especially as you move further north, of course. It does get quite shorter. I'm headed to Minnesota in a few days, and they've got snow on the ground there still right now. It just came down, coming down again. I have an example of a provider in North Dakota who waited 9 months to get through NEPA review of something that should have been categorically excluded, but just to get confirmation of that. And by the time they got that review, they had to sit because they had to wait for several months before they could start because it came right around to the November timeframe. So yes, Congressman, it is a significant issue. Again, having shot clocks that are more concrete and definitions that are more established will allow providers to have that predictability to deliver sooner on that promise.
I think predictability is ultimate in being able to expand our broadband access. And building broadband in rural areas, we recognize is challenging and it's expensive. Could you describe in more detail permitting regulations at the federal level that are impeding broadband deployment?
So the two that I think stick out most are the overarching sort of umbrella statutes of NEPA and National Historic Preservation Act. They're incredibly important, but there are circumstances in which we've talked about proportionality. Really, proportionality is critical here to the application of those. If it's in a previously disturbed right-of-way, if it's in a critical circumstance of restoration of a network, those are circumstances that really contribute greatly to the costs of deploying a network in a place where it's already been deployed before. It's simply, in many cases, upgrading copper to fiber, for example. So, those are two of the biggest, delays that we see, and in turn, they result in the increase of cost for reasons that others have explained in this panel. That time delay leads to inflation in the ability to procure supplies and for having to refine contractors.
And thank you for recognizing that those time delay recognizably increase the cost. I think that's an important takeaway message for all of us. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, again for this important hearing, and I yield the remainder of my time.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired and yields back. And at this time, the chair recognizes the gentlelady from Texas for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chairman Latta. Thanks to you and Ranking Member Matsui for convening today's hearing to discuss the challenges we face in deploying next-generation communications networks throughout the country. And thanks to the witnesses for taking the time to be here and share your expertise and testimony with us today. As we all know, broadband infrastructure is essential infrastructure. And like many of my colleagues here have already mentioned and talked about throughout this hearing, I was very proud to support the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the largest long-term investment in our country's infrastructure in nearly a century. As we've discussed, the bill included almost $43 billion for BEAD broadband expansion program. And while some of this money has already arrived for planning, the majority of it will soon be on its way to states, territories, and tribal governments. And with this funding will come a flood of applications to deploy infrastructure, the towers, fiber, small cells needed to provide these broadband connections, and local offices will be strained reviewing and processing these applications. Right now, we have a unique opportunity to capitalize on these federal investments and to close the digital divide. And that is why I am so pleased that in our hearing today, we are including my bill, the Broadband Incentives for Communities Act, which provides grants for local governments to hire and train employees, purchase software, upgrade capabilities, so essential for permitting and for the effective deployment of these funds so that we can really close the digital divide. So I want to ask just a couple of questions on that note. Both Mr. Romano and Mr. Saperstein, in your testimony and in response to Mr. Soto a little while ago, you described some of the challenges that your members have faced when obtaining authorizations and permits. That's been a theme throughout the day. Obviously, we also heard it from Representative Curtis as well. Can you talk about how legislation like the Broadband Incentives for Communities Act would help address those challenges and prevent bottlenecks at the local level?
Yes, thank you, Congressman. Thank you for that question. Thank you for the legislation as well. I agree with you fully. One of the things we hear most of all is the procedures do need to be improved, and I think we support a lot of the measures here for that very reason, but we also then need to execute. And execution is going to be critical, and I think measures like yours that look at how do you make sure the offices are primed, the pump is primed for them to deliver on anything else we do in terms of streamlining permitting is going to be critical. So systems, training, online portals, getting better staffing, training people to respond to this, that will enable better communication that ultimately delivers on all of these other things that we're talking about.
Thank you. Mr. Saperstein?
Yes, thank you for the question. I agree with Mr. Romano, and it sounds from the discussion that we all agree that it's critical that local governments have the resources and expertise needed to review these projects quickly so we can get these services out there. Your help in focusing on being broadband ready is greatly appreciated. And I would also add that NTIA has recently emphasized the importance of being broadband ready, and we appreciate that focus there too. So thank you.
Well, terrific, and you actually anticipated my next question, which I was actually going to direct over to Mr. Falcone. But the bill does aim to address, to bring stakeholders together through NTIA to establish a local broadband advisory council so that problems with deployment can be addressed in a collaborative manner, sharing experiences and other best practices. And so it's modeled after work that we've done in my city of Houston, which has been a real leader in broadband deployment and 5G broadband deployment in particular. So a key factor to success has been the close relationship between all of those working to get it done, between city leaders and the private sector and others. And the city's technology investments in Houston, I know, will make a huge economic impact in our region for years to come. So, Mr. Falcone, with the time we have left, which is just a little over a minute, could you you described the bill as a win-win for communities and industry in your testimony. And I was just hoping you could take a few seconds to talk about the importance of that public-private cooperation and partnership, particularly in the early stages of these projects.
Certainly, thank you for that question. I think particularly for cities that have just as many needs in terms of the successful implementation of BEAD, the rights of way are crowded. And I think the need to explore alternative ways to deploy wires. One of your provisions in your bill includes improving micro trenching and expanding on that. I think micro trenching is a pretty key solution to deployment. It's cheaper to deploy. It allows new ways to reach different corridors, communities without trying to refigure out accessing crowded out rights of way. And I think there are even new forms of accessing city infrastructure to deploy the wires. I've heard ideas of using kind of the stormwater system, which runs throughout the city, is another one that's under works today. So these types of collaborations are key, and everyone wins if we all work together.
Thank you so much. I'm over my time. And so, Mr. Chairman, as I yield back, I would like to enter some documents for the record in support of the bill.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all.
Thank you. The gentlelady yields back. At this time, the chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas's 14th District for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you all for joining us today to discuss these much-needed permitting reforms. This Congress, I'm going to be leading the Cable Transparency Act. This bill will streamline the franchising process for cable operators and franchise authorities to make it less costly and burdensome, which currently deters new entrants. The Cable Transparency Act would help close the digital divide by encouraging new cable providers to enter markets and create more competition and thereby lower consumer costs, which we're all in favor of. So question for you, Mr. O'Reilly. Cable providers are important players in the broadband marketplace. I think we'd all agree and recognize that. What are some factors or barriers to entry that they face as they enter new markets or try to modify their franchises where they already operate?
So you have a number of franchises that are aggressive in trying to extend some of the obligations that they would like to add when they actually don't have authority to do so. And so in terms of simplifying the franchise process, I think that's very important, and the transparency is very important. But they face, polls is one of the biggest issues. Pole attachments, the ability to get access to the infrastructure that they're going to need to attach fiber and coax to serve the communities that are unserved today. Through the grants that they will receive and expand. So polls is a very big issue. The whole permitting process and the culmination of the legislation, that the bills that are before the subcommittee would be very helpful, including yours especially.
Well, that's good to know. And the gentleman to your right there would be very interested in polls and the application of the system. But I still have a question for you. Maybe for the panel too. What other deterrents we really haven't discussed is access to capital. Does that play a part in any of this procedures? You're shaking your head. Why?
Because the business case for rural broadband can be incredibly challenging. I mean, we're talking distances and densities that don't present a business case. It's a market failure in some areas. And so the extent to which I've had members say before, you could give me 100 cents on the dollar and I still wouldn't build it because the operating expenses and the ability to maintain affordable rates is difficult. So that is a barrier as well.
Is workforce availability a problem? Yes, sir.
Yes, thank you for the question. That's one of the things that WA has really leaned in on, is making sure that we have the next generation technicians who are going to be out there propelling all of this infrastructure. And so we have not only our registered apprenticeship program, but we're also working with states as part of the BEAD program to be a registered intermediary.
Are we experiencing supply chain issues? We'll go to you, Mr. Is it Finkel? I can't see that for.
Yes, sir. I mean, supply chain, as this Congress has talked about over the last 3 years, is a huge problem economy-wide. But when you're talking about $65 billion worth of build-out with federal dollars, plus private investment, plus upgrading existing infrastructure in well-served communities, I mean, and it's not just domestic, it's a global supply chain that we're competing in. So without question, supply chain's a huge challenge.
Anybody else? Mr. Is it Falcone or Falcon?
Falcone. Yeah, I would echo much of what was said here. I think to the question of access to capital, I think there's also a need to look at alternative means of deploying the infrastructure. Treating it as purely as an infrastructure, I think, changes some of the long-term investment strategies that are out there that the BEAD has provided an opportunity for. I think there are ways we need to think about how to share the infrastructure, particularly for 5G in rural markets, that we haven't really explored much today. But there are going to be challenges that small providers can't shoulder the burden completely alone out there.
Were you the one that brought up micro-trenching?
Yes.
That kind of got my attention. Describe that for us, please.
Yeah, so it's basically, the issue is a lot of the rights of way that exist are already crowded. They're already utilized by a number of providers or a number of other entities. And sometimes a provider just needs to run their fiber down a handful of streets to get from one side of a community to another to connect their network, and they just need to trench through the street itself. So digging more in a shallow way, in an expedited way, allows them to connect an area that they wouldn't be able to by running through traditional conduit or other means you would normally do it.
So, in other words, in a yard, they put cable in your yard, because I have cable in my yard, and they bring a little trencher out there that makes a groove, and they lay that cable down. I bet it's not 4 or 5 inches deep.
Yeah, I think the challenge has been a lot of local communities are not familiar with this. One thing that California did was standardize kind of safety protocols around microtrenching and then publish that to local jurisdictions. So it kind of took some of the guesswork about what's the right way to do it.
Gotcha. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the time. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. At this time, the chair recognizes the gentlelady from Illinois for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Latta and Ranking Member Matsui, for holding this important hearing this morning. I also want to thank our witnesses for your testimony to help us understand how we in Congress may help reduce unnecessary barriers to broadband deployment. Although the last few years have been clouded with challenges like the COVID-19 pandemic and resulting chips and supply chain shortages that hurt our economy, I was so very proud to stand with my colleagues last Congress as we passed the Bipartisan Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or the IIJA. Watching it get signed into law was a historic day for our country and proved that we are working on behalf of the American people to deliver real results. Importantly, the bipartisan bill made a huge investment of $65 billion to expand broadband and help close the digital divide to ensure that every American has access to reliable high-speed internet. My district is urban, suburban, and rural, and I've seen the problem, urban, suburban, and rural. Mr. Falcone, I was particularly moved by your written testimony where you said without 21st century ready connectivity, you are not a full participant in society. As we look to expand broadband deployment, I'm very concerned still that certain communities will be left behind as they have been with other emerging technologies and advancement. To ensure the promise of the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment BEAD program can be fulfilled, what recommendations do you have for us as we look to ensure access is delivered to everyone?
So thank you for that question. I think the fact that the Congress created the Digital Discrimination Rulemaking Authority, the FCC, is a recognition that there always has to be oversight to ensure equitable outcomes, given historically that has not happened. So rigorous enforcement of that new authority, the FCC, is going to be key.
Okay. And also, what can the FCC do in its rulemaking to ensure that this practice ends for good and we get rid of this two-tiered broadband infrastructure?
Thank you for that question. The big debate at the FCC between, I would say, the civil rights community and many in the consumer advocacy space with industry is when does liability trigger from the new digital discrimination rule? The civil rights community argue, and in line of many other civil rights statutes, that it should be a disparate impact standard, meaning, what is the statistical information on the ground? What does the evidence show? And a number in industry are arguing it should be disparate treatment, which would raise the standard of liability to a point where you would be very difficult to actually prove. I think that actually contradicts what Congress intended with the passage of the law, because when you invest a lot of dollars in terms of BEAD, to simultaneously say, ensure that all people receive the benefit. Equal access means equal for all people.
Also, millions of Americans, many of whom are older or lower income, have access to broadband but do not adopt broadband because they don't understand how to use it or the value it can add to their lives. To address the adoption barrier, we need to promote digital equity, which, among other things, focuses on providing digital literacy and skill training for people who have not been afforded an opportunity to develop these skills. Mr. Falcone, can you speak about the challenges of broadband adoption, how we can best address these needs? And then Commissioner O'Reilly, can you make comments if you have any?
Thank you for that question. The challenge of adoption is there has to be a lot of training and sensitivity to that. There's a lot of Americans who really don't really know how to use the internet fully. Need to be acclimated and helped. A lot in the senior citizen population, for example. And there's a value to getting everyone connected and everyone acclimated to the internet. This is something that we're not reinventing the wheel here. South Korea did something similar to advance their economy where they're at now. They gave people free computers and trained people how to use the internet.
If you look to reasons why people haven't adopted, why families haven't adopted, it's a long list. Affordability is one of them, and I've talked about that today and elsewhere. But digital literacy and the benefits and education on broadband benefits is important, and Congress has obviously made so and going to provide funding for that purpose for the first time. So there's other programs that have touched on it, but literacy and the value of it to individuals, we'll see what the result is from that.
Thank you so much, and Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back, and this time the chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia's 12th District for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Latta, and again, thank you to our witnesses for being with us today. Since I was first elected to Congress, expanding rural broadband and improving cellular service in my district has been among my top priorities, and it sounds like it's the priorities of every member that has asked questions today. It is frustrating when it seems that no matter how many billions of dollars we appropriate towards this mission, it just gets more complicated and it's incomplete. It's almost like we can't do big things in this country anymore. A top priority of mine last Congress was to reduce waste, fraud, and abuse by making sure that the federal broadband maps are as accurate as our broadband mapping is in the state of Georgia. Now I'm concerned about the fees that some state and local governments charge for processing applications and using space in public right-of-ways. I'm concerned that these costs will only increase the cost of deployment and make it hard to provide service to those who need it. Mr. Sappington and Mr. Romano, could you describe typical application fees associated with building broadband infrastructure at the state and local level? And is there a high level of variance between one state and one locality and another?
Well, thank you for the question. One of the things that the FCC's reforms have done is help to standardize the FCC's fees and make them cost-based. And that's one of the things that we're seeking to be made permanent by Congress today, is to eliminate some of those wild disparities that we used to see where fees were not cost-based.
Okay. Thank you. Given these fees, I'm concerned that we will not be maximizing the money we've dedicated for broadband deployment. This money needs to go towards building new networks, not helping local governments. This is especially true for the $42 billion that has been dedicated to the BEAD program. Mr. O'Reilly, why is it necessary to cap fees to state and local governments that state and local governments charge for deployment under the BEAD program?
So you absolutely have it right. The money should go to the build-out. We have a number of locations that need to be addressed, households that don't have service, the unserved population needs to be addressed, and that money needs to go for those, and we'll probably, at the end of that, still have a problem and still have a percentage. So you can't use up the dollars on other functions like permitting fees, permitting applications and everything else that they're trying to overcharge the applicants.
Exactly, and that's why we're here today. We need legislation to correct that. Mr. Riley, when you were on the FCC, you acted to prevent local and state governments from blanket banning the deployment of telecommunications services or facilities. From your perspective, have regions who have been unfriendly to the deployment of such facilities in the past been less responsive in processing permitting applications in a timely manner?
Whenever there is a barrier in the past, whenever there was a problem, you saw the dollars and where the construction would go to somewhere else. The providers would shift dollars to somewhere else, and those communities would suffer. This, what's left is what we're dealing with, the population that needs attention, both on economic reasons and some because of the shifting of attention is really important. So you highlight the issue of how receptivity is the community, how receptive, is the application process, the permitting process is really important to how the dollars will flow.
Well, would you all agree that, when it comes to federal funding, you're dealing with interstate commerce? So all things being equal, shouldn't it be standard reasonable fees across the country?
I agree with that, and I've made that point a number of times, so I agree absolutely.
Okay. Anyone else object to that?
No, not object at all. I was going to say to the contrary. We were part of the Broadband Deployment Advisory Council or Committee at the FCC when then Commissioner O'Reilly was at the FCC as well. And I think that group, there were a number of us in that group, including NTCA, who supported cost-based fees, so that the actual and direct cost. And I think several of the pieces of legislation here aim to do that as well, and that's welcome.
Okay, well, you have my support to provide legislation that let's get this done, and so America can do big things again. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back, and the chair recognizes the gentlelady from California 16th District for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and for always being so specific about the number of my district. It's a
If I could just interject, the gentlelady has informed me. I was wrong one time.
Well, thank you. And a thank you to all of the witnesses. I served 10 wonderful years on the San Mateo County Board of Supervisors in California before I was elected to the House in 1992. And I hold a deep reverence for local government to this very day. Academicians, political leaders from both parties, industry groups, public interest groups all agree that universal high-speed internet is necessary for our country's competitiveness in the 21st century. I mean, there just isn't a question about this. This is accepted across the board. The pandemic made this need even more evident as so many had to transition to teleworking, schools operating through distance learning, doctor visits via telehealth. It's currently estimated that 24 million Americans lack internet access, a problem that is far more acute in rural and tribal communities in our country. And this number is just those who lack access. Millions more simply can't even afford high-speed internet. Last Congress, Democrats made a generational investment to bridge the digital divide and bring reliable, high-speed internet to every American household. That's the goal. $82 billion with a B dollars for broadband affordability, equity, deployment. I think one of the most promising solutions to closing the digital divide that I've seen comes from local communities. That's why I started my comments out about serving in local government, county government in California. Over 900 counties, cities, local utilities, co-ops, neighborhood association, and tribes are taking on the digital divide into their own hands by building their own broadband networks. Community broadband systems expand internet access to unserved and underserved areas and encourage competition across the country. And here's the thing about locally owned networks. They work really well. In 2019, in a 2019 report, New America's Open Technology Institute called these networks, quote, the fast, affordable internet option that's flying under the radar. Unfortunately, 19 states have enacted they're protectionist laws. I mean, that's what they are. That's what they deserve to be called, that restrict and in some cases ban community networks. This is, I think it's wrong. So many, we all espouse competitiveness in our country, but there are some outfits, when they see competition from 5,000 miles away, they go and squash it like a bug. So that's essentially what has happened here. So to solve this problem, I introduced the Community Broadband Act, which simply prohibits state laws that ban or restrict community broadband. There's always talk about the reverence we have for states and local governments, except when it comes to legislating. So here's an opportunity, I think, for us to underscore that. I think every solution to bring reliable and affordable internet to Americans should be available. Commissioner O'Reilly, thank you for the work that you've done at the FCC. We partnered on so many issues, and I think we're both legitimately proud of that. And I don't know whether you support my legislation or not, but let me ask Mr. Falcone and Mr. Saperstein, do you support the Community Broadband Act?
100%, absolutely. It is, if we are serious about getting...
Music to my ears.
If we're serious about getting everyone connected, all hands have to be on deck.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Saperstein?
Yes, so as wireless infrastructure providers, we support communities providing service, well, whatever service provider wants to serve any given area.
And Commissioner O'Reilly, do you?
Well,
and if not, how do we get your support?
So I am more sympathetic on the ban side, where there are limitations, and I've done a number of blogs on this topic. I've examined these issues, things like referendums, rights of first refusal, having a budget. That's been pointed out as having that's an objection and a barrier, and therefore should be prohibited. A state shouldn't mandate that they actually have to have a budget from someone who's a community that's going to offer this service. I think there are so that's some of the states. That's some of the 19 you mentioned. There are a number, and it used to be bigger. It's shrinking.
19.
Yeah, but I'm saying the number that actually have the ban, the straight up ban across the board, and that's a little different in my mind. I'd explore in terms of there are also a lot of advantages that I'm very worried come to the local community broadband network that wouldn't be available, that are not available.
You're squishy on it.
On this issue, on this issue, I'm a little squishy. I might lean more to the.
I just want you to know how fair I am in asking you when I know that you weren't 100%.
Probably less squishy in me and maybe in lean
exactly.
no category.
Maybe we got rid of some of the squishiness. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to our wonderful ranking member, Congresswoman Matsui. This is an important hearing, and I thank you for having it, and thank the witnesses.
Well, thank you very much. The gentle lady's time has expired, and the gentle lady from Tennessee is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the panelists that are here today. Mr. Saperstein, in your testimony, you discussed the barriers to broadband caused by lengthy government reviews. Do you agree with me that the government's way too big and permitting is way too slow? You can say yes.
Yes.
Okay, good deal. Well, under the Trump administration, the FCC instituted a 60-day shot clock for making technology updates on existing cell towers. That it's crucial that the telecommunications industry can make any updates to existing towers for the transition to 5G for future technologies. It's common sense. Making a technological update on an existing tower shouldn't be a tremendously controversial change. I mean, is attaching the equipment to a pole that difficult, or it's just the permitting, am I correct?
That's correct.
Okay. I'm leading the 5G Upgrade Act, which would codify this shot clock. So if a state or a local government takes too long approving a permit for adjusting technology on an existing tower, it's automatically approved. And I guess my question to you is, why is that important that the shot clock be codified as law?
Thank you for the question and for your support of the 5G Upgrade Act. Many of the reforms that were made recently in the FCC's 5G Upgrade Order are currently under appeal, and we don't know how those are going to turn out. So making sure that those are codified is essential so we can have common sense reforms, so co-locations can have the streamlined reviews. We can get 5G upgraded quickly everywhere.
Yeah, I have a rural district in East Tennessee, and it's imperative. You know, there's so many things that we can do if we have that. So, you know, broadband and everything else. So there's much to do, but dragging our feet is not the answer. So I think I appreciate your agreement with me that the government's too big and the permitting's too slow. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Well, thank you. The gentleman yields back, and the chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas's 11th District for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And, you know, I appreciate the leadership that Chair Rogers has shown on this, and I love the discussion on permitting reform, whether it's energy or telecommunications, broadband, electricity, it doesn't really matter. You know, this is a commitment that we made to the American public to deliver at the speed of relevancy. And I think we're currently, you know, being inhibited in a lot of areas by government delays, inaction, and otherwise. So I appreciate the conversation. I just want to start with that because I think if we don't pay attention to that, inevitably we're going to lose. We've had the same discussion on satellites in this committee and spectrum, and we're going to lose to China if we don't continue to move at the speed of relevancy. So, Commissioner O'Reilly, I'd kind of like to start by talking about you know, the difficulty to track permitting applications once it's submitted to a federal agency.
So depending on the agency, my experience is that different agencies are more receptive and more capable of handling the process and being favorable to the, excuse me, apology for that. I'm responsible for my kids. So anytime
we understand.
Anytime local school calls, so the application process and the actually approval process is extremely tough to follow, and the providers can highlight how that gets lost in the shuffle, and years can go before the action is actually taken, much less know what's happening. And the commission itself, as a former commissioner, we wouldn't be able to see any of that. You know, from other agencies. Ourselves, you know, the activity that we did, you know, was to move forward on all the balls that your colleague highlighted and really push the envelope as far as we could.
So, Mr. Romano or any others on the panel, your thoughts on how difficult it is to track?
Thank you for the question. Yes, I would agree, and I'll give you an example. I was talking to a member in Michigan just last night who applied for a permit in August of 2022. Despite repeated inquiries, couldn't get word back on where that stood until December of 2022, which then put their shot clock starting then, which puts them into August of 2023 for their 270 days, which then becomes a problem because of frozen ground in Michigan when they want to start construction. So having greater transparency, greater responsiveness, greater levels of communication is going to be critically important. There are a lot of dedicated people working on these permitting issues, but having systems and processes in place to provide greater transparency will be critical.
Well, thank you for that. I'm proud to introduce the you know, a bill that will have a tracking mechanism, you know, to have the deployment tracking, to understand what the facts are, to better communicate between government and industry. You know, in a rural area like I represent in West Texas, you know, look, there's billions of dollars that have been spent on this, and we want to see the results. We want to see connectivity. And I'm just interested, Mr. Finkel, I'm interested in your thoughts on this. Is there an intentional delay towards rural areas?
Well, look, I'm not sure that there's an intentional delay, but I think that by nature, a lot of these agencies just move real slow. They add a level of redundancy. There's agencies that are duplicative, that are tripping over each other when they're doing reviews. And one of the things that was in my testimony was that, working across 48 states, our members, when we get aggregated stories from them, you'll have different field offices for different agencies which have totally different and completely different approaches, different timelines. So they're all moving through the process at a different pace. So even when you get that transparency, you're going to see a great degree of discrepancy between the different offices within the same agency.
Well, I'm not a conspiracy theorist here, and I don't want to inject things that may not be happening, but I think it's clear that the inefficiencies, whether it's intentional or not, or the lack of tracking, whether it's intentional or not, okay, let's fix the problem now. And let's deploy broadband into areas that need it. And for our area, this is energy. This is, the energy capital of America. It's agriculture. It's the men and women who work in those industries. It's a safety issue. And as I mentioned earlier, I think that this is a national security issue with regards to competing with China every single day, because they're doing this and they're deploying it, and we need to get our act together. So thank y'all for testifying and for your thoughts today. And I appreciate your professional expertise here. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Ohio's 12th District for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the panel for being here. Too many people in my district across Ohio, as I have 3 Ohioans here, so they can all speak for the same, and too often the build-out of new networks can be delayed or even sidelined completely due to lengthy applications for franchising or permitting, zoning problems, issues with access to poles, and more. Congress needs to do something. The bills being discussed here today would do just that, and I applaud the chairman for hosting this committee. My bill, the Cable Leadership Act, puts a shot clock on franchising authorities to grant or deny a franchise to providers. This is the only one of the many applications that need to be submitted and approved before providers can start building out new broadband networks. Mr. Romano, I know that you don't represent cable companies, so you can't give input on that specific bill, but could you give some great examples in your testimony about how your members' projects have been delayed? What tools, such as shot clock, can Congress employ to streamline the approval process and prevent such delays?
Thank you, Congressman, for that. And in fact, it's interesting. We do have a handful of cable companies within our membership, so there is some relevance there as well directly, too. Yes, I think the biggest things we see and I think where these bills would help tremendously is certainty, providing definitional certainty, knowing what it means for something to be complete, what it means for something to be received, providing greater certainty and transparency into the process. The lack of communication, as I mentioned earlier, is a real concern, the inability to see and predict what's going to be coming next. Our members are small companies. A lot of cable companies are small cable companies as well. Their ability to hire construction crews depends upon knowing when they're going to be able to hit the ground running. And if they don't have that, they can't line that up, which complicates both the cost and the timing of keeping those crews busy. So all of those things are significant hurdles, and I think the measures before this committee would help to alleviate those, if not address them completely.
All right, thank you. Sorry. Thank you. And Mr. Romano, I'm going to include you on this next question too, but also Michael Seberstein. I'm curious, where most of these delays occur, as I've mentioned, various applications and approvals are needed from all levels of government before a provider can start building out a new network. Are your members, both of you, are your members seeing these delays occur more often at the federal level or state and local level?
I think just by nature of the areas they serve, it tends to be more of a federal issue because, especially as you get out west, our members are serving a lot of federal lands, Forest Service, BLM, and the like. But state highways can be an issue as well, and I would be remiss if I did not mention railroads. Railroads are a significant issue in rural areas in terms of crossings. I have examples in my testimony of people going 15 feet and paying significant sums for that. So, but it tends to be more of a federal land issue, but then that does bring in state historical preservation offices at times for some of those federal reviews, which again is why these measures are so important.
Thank you.
Yes, and thank you for the question. I would agree, due to congressional and FCC action, that most of the delay we're seeing now is on the federal level. One thing I wanted to highlight is that one of the big challenges we're seeing now is that the FAA actually has to approve certain towers that are over a certain height, use certain frequencies, or in a certain proximity to airports. What was taking 3 weeks about a year ago is now taking 9 months to a year. And so we are looking for federal guidance and I believe it's a resource issue, how we can get that better resource so we don't delay 5G rollout.
Thank you. My last question is for Mr. O'Reilly. I can hardly see, but I see it through the thing here.
I'm with you.
Anyway, in your, and I've been in and out, and as you're well aware of, but in your testimony, you talked about the FCC, which I did read, and needed to take it upon itself to alleviate barriers to broadband deployment, often pushing its statutory boundaries. Do you feel that the FCC should be granted more latitude to tackle barriers to deployment as they come up, and if so, in what areas? And you have 50 seconds.
So I agree with the package of legislation, and there's probably some things I would do to make them stronger. I would believe the committee and the subcommittee should always limit and structure what the FCC, what you ask out of the FCC. But in terms of aggressiveness and the need to act, I think the FCC can be very helpful in this case. Certainly, as we talked about polls, I think the FCC can address all the polls nationwide. Don't have to have the exemption for certain municipal or non-utilities or co-ops. So I think that the commission can handle those things and can handle other authority. They've done a very good job, I think, in this universe. And if you give them direction and limitations, they will follow you, they will follow it closely. If you give them broad authority, then you run into some issues sometimes.
Thank you all very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back, and the chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Florida's 3rd District for 5 minutes.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Chairman Latta, for hosting this important hearing today. Thank you to our witnesses for appearing. I see you all have been bunched up real tight this entire hearing. I've been noticing the elbow room as I've been dipping in and out of the room. So we are near the end. Hang in there. This is such an important topic. I know we have chatted about this and how we can do this in a way that is efficient, responsible, and hits the mark. And every single person who serves today has a district that is impacted by broadband or lack thereof. And so I'm excited that we're starting to really address some of these issues. All of our witnesses here today, I'm sure, share the concerns that the process for permitting is too complicated, opaque, time-consuming. I heard a little bit about some of the delays that we're having. In your view, what is the single most urgent change needed to the permitting process in order to best deploy broadband across the country, especially in rural areas like Florida? And I would like to address this question to each of you, and we'll start down here and work our way down.
So poll attachments, both access and rates, and I actually wrote a letter a number of years ago to the State House in Florida because they were looking to simplify that process there.
I'm shocked by your answer. That's my joke for the day. Mr. Finkel.
Expediting the process on existing right-of-ways on existing poles to make sure that you don't have to go through an EIS to put wire on existing infrastructure.
Okay.
I think increasing the personnel resources available, given the surge of projects that are coming in, is key to shorten the review time.
So at the agency level?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you for the question. For federal lands, it's adding clarity, accountability, and transparency to that process, in addition to looking at what more resources can be given to FAA to avoid a bottleneck there.
Okay.
And thank you again, Congresswoman, for the question. So yes, I think it's, to echo some of the others, dealing with reviews for previously disturbed rights-of-way and previously disturbed earth, those, the ability to upgrade networks quickly, where especially we've already got networks in place, is going to be critical to delivering on next-generation capabilities and capacity.
Excellent. Thank you. As we're considering a number of bills that are working to address some of these more nuanced issues, myself in particular, I'm really glad to lead the discussion draft for the Digital Applications Act, which would establish an online portal to accept, process, and dispose of the common form application to deploy a communications facility on federal property. Mr. Finkel, can you discuss the current challenges with the common form application, SF 299, and how an online portal for permitting applications would benefit broadband deployment on federal property?
It's just common sense.
Thank you. You know, and common sense is not common around here. So,
I don't need to add much more.
you mentioned federal property.
Yeah, and thanks for the question. Actually, portals are one of the things our members have talked about that is a simple fix that would add so much transparency into what's going on and allow more predictability in the overall build cycle.
Just going down the line, legislation like this to basically modernize the process and make it more transparent, you would fully support. And it would be silly for anyone to oppose this legislation, correct? Just go,
Yes.
we'll start down.
Yes, gaps in communication are incredibly frustrating. At a time when we can track so many things in our daily lives online and check on the status of different things, from airline flights to train schedules, it is difficult to understand why we cannot keep track of these significant investments in our future. Yes.
I think Mr. Romano said that well.
Mr. Falcon.
Yeah, no, I would agree, and I think the coordination amongst, if there's several agencies involved, is also key. Some sort of single point of contact may be a way to augment the value of a portal.
Excellent.
And the portal, again, makes it so all agencies can see it, creates transparency for the applicant. You have a clear picture of what your process is.
If you don't say ditto, I'm going to be disappointed.
Ditto, I support. I agree with the legislation. I may not use the word silly, only in the sense, but I'm hard pressed to come up with a reason to oppose it.
Excellent. Well, thank you guys for making the case for that wonderful piece of legislation. What expected risks and challenges in the absence of permitting reform, considering the massive amount of federal dollars dedicated to broadband deployment, do we face over the next few years? Just, we've got 30 seconds. Give me your number one concern if we don't act. We'll go down the line.
I'm worried about overbuilding, and I'm worried about waste, fraud, and abuse.
Okay.
Worried the money won't get out.
Ooh.
I'd be worried about costs rising and minimizing the impact of the dollars invested.
Yeah, simply that we would fail our objective of universal connectivity.
A crush of applications leading to chaos and trying to sort through them all to get them done.
Excellent. With 2 seconds to spare, Mr. Chairman, my time has expired. Thank you to our witnesses for appearing before us today, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back, and the chair now recognizes the gentleman from Idaho for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And for those on the panel willing to take the time and provide some input to us, we all want rural broadband, and the permitting process, as we've had many discussions on, sometimes slows things down and makes it tough. In the state of Idaho, we have a tremendous amount of federal land, nearly 2/3 of the landmass there. And in my state, rural carriers and utilities struggle to get approvals to lay fiber lines, set up towers, construct buildings, and other infrastructure to ensure residents that are physically located in regions surrounded by federal lands, or in other words, kind of landlocked that way, so they can get the same access and quality broadband as those in urban areas. And so by streamlining the federal side of the permitting, then that gives the access and the quality for broadband to those in rural areas and just make it that much more achievable. So one of the bills that I am introducing is it's called the Reducing Barriers to Broadband on Federal Lands Act. And this bill would remove the requirement to do a NEPA review for the deployment of broadband projects that are on previously disturbed lands. And that previously disturbed, basically, to summarize, means that there's already been a NEPA process for other purposes. And so otherwise, these projects end up just not making it through the planning stage. And there's multiple examples right in my backyard where that's been the case. So, Mr. Chair, there is a report that I'd like to enter into the record. It's from the National Telecom and Information Administration. They published a report that provides recommendations on how federal agencies can improve or streamline their processes for reviewing broadband installation applications. And I would ask unanimous consent to enter that report into the record, please.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And basically, my questions and my request for interaction from you all is, first of all, do you see specific problems? And I'll start with Mr. Romano and then Mr. Saperstein and Mr. Finkel. Do you see problems with that when we're looking to streamline by foregoing NEPA again when it comes to permitting for rural broadband? Mr. Romano.
Thank you, Congressman, for the question, and thank you for the discussion draft you put forward, the bill you put forward. We support that bill. We think that it makes a ton of sense. The landlocked point you raised is a really good one, an interesting one. I think it's one of these pieces that's hard to capture sometimes, but the puzzle pieces of putting together when you're going across federal land and then you're in private right of way, then you're going across a railroad, that can make it incredibly hard, especially for a smaller provider. So I think a bill like yours offers an opportunity to help put the puzzle pieces together better. I don't think when you're talking about previously disturbed earth, previously disturbed rights of way, you're talking about upgrading existing networks, that hopefully is a proportional response that allows you to make sure that you're not you're not presenting the kinds of concerns that would rise to a higher level of scrutiny or need a higher level of scrutiny with respect to environmental or historical preservation issues. So I think this bill makes a lot of sense. It's a good use of finding a way to make sure it's not considered a major federal action or an undertaking under those statutes.
Thank you for that. Mr. Saperstein?
Yes, and thank you for the question. So our view is that permitting process should be predictable, proportionate, and timely. And I think your bill speaks specifically to the proportionality. In the types of circumstances you're describing, do we really need the types of NEPA reviews, or are we better off exempting them? And I think your bill goes a long way towards that.
Thank you for that. Mr. Finkel?
As I shared with the chair earlier, the idea that you'd have to greenfield existing right-of-way that you've already, an existing infrastructure that's already been through NEPA process just seems totally redundant and waste of both time and federal resources.
Thank you for that. Mr. O'Reilly?
I support your legislation. I think it's the right direction to go, and the requirement is not necessary in my mind.
Great. We'll ask Mr. Falcon, too.
Thank you. To the extent that many of the projects are transitioning legacy infrastructure to kind of 21st century infrastructure and previously disturbed ground, I think it is right to think about how do you distinguish that from actual greenfield projects.
Thank you for that, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to have 20 seconds to spare. Yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California's 23rd District for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I represent an extremely rural district, and the problems that my constituents have in accessing broadband are exacerbated by the fact that over 90% of the landmass of my district is in public ownership in one form or another. So it's not enough to merely allocate grant funding to be able to create broadband infrastructure in these rural areas. We then will have to manage this process of getting that infrastructure built through the publicly held land that separates the communications hubs from the places where my constituents live. I know that you're very familiar with that particular problem. So one of the bills that we are discussing today is my bill, the Granted Act, which aims to solve in some small part that problem. Congress has already directed the FCC to expedite the processing of those permits required to cross federal lands, either through lands held by the BLM or sometimes the Department of Agriculture. We've directed a common application for those permits, and we have put a shot clock of 270 days on the approval of those permits. Unfortunately, what we are experiencing is that in many occurrences, the federal agencies involved take more than 270 days to process those permits, and unfortunately, there are no penalties or consequences for them doing that. So my bill would deem approval for any application for broadband infrastructure across public lands that has been pending for more than 270 days, provided that application was full and complete when it was submitted. And I think that's a common sense way of solving that problem. I'd be interested in your opinion on that concept. Are you a supporter of that kind of deemed approval after 270 days has occurred? Let's start with the end of the table here, Mr. Morano.
Yes, Congressman, thank you for the question. Yes, we do. We think that makes a lot of sense. And I think what this highlights too, one of the things I want to be clear about as well is a lot of the bills that are being presented here refer back to 6409, the section of the, which is a wireless facility deployment. So one of the other bills that's present, this proceeding, would attempt to stitch this together and make sure those also apply to wireline. And I think that's going to be critical. I think a lot of the concepts here that are presented make a ton of sense and would help to expedite deployment. I think it's going to be critical as well to make sure those dots connect, to make sure they apply to wireless and wireline facility deployment alike to the extent
That's a good point. Mr. Saperstein.
Yes, thank you for the question. And yes, we support your bill, and we believe it would help adding accountability to the federal lands process, because currently, though Congress has set this 270-day shot clock, there is no accountability and there is no recourse if they fail to meet it.
Right, I hope so too. Mr. Falcon?
Thank you for that question. I think if the staffing personnel is made available, permits can be turned over faster. And a common issue I hear, particularly in California with rural carriers, is there's just not that many people there for reviewing permits. So, I think it's a fixable problem that can bring it down to that number that you're shooting for in terms of 270 days.
Mr. Finkel?
I'll associate myself with the comments of Mr. Romano on both, including wireless and wireline. But let me also, you noted and you used full and complete application, and that's when the shot clock would end. So just one thing to consider is oftentimes with agencies that have the time limitations, how they define full and complete, and whether or not they restart the shot clock because they deem you to not have been full and complete, and how they communicate and whether or not they're transparent about the full and complete is a really important factor to consider as well.
Yeah, I actually think that's an excellent point. We've tried to be very thoughtful and deliberate with our approach to that problem in the text of the bill, but we are certainly open to any suggestions that you might have to differentiate perhaps between the shot clock for declaring an application complete and the 270 days required to review it, because what we don't want is to get the end of day 269 and have an agency come back and say, oh, you know what, you failed to include this piece of paper, we're starting over, at day 0. Mr. O'Reilly?
Yeah, I've got experience of that at the FCC. But to your point, I actually very much support your legislation. I think you're maybe being a little generous on 270 days.
Well, we'll have to think about that. Well, thank you very much, and we'll continue to work with you as we work through the legislative process with this bill. But I think we're all unified in our desire to increase this access to rural, access to broadband infrastructure and solve some of these systemic problems. I'll yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. At this time, the chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio's 6th District for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm really proud to once again this session be sponsoring the Wireless Broadband Competition and Efficient Deployment Act that would remove the requirement for environmental and historic preservation reviews in order to add or upgrade wireless facilities on existing infrastructure. This is common sense, and it would eliminate a tremendous burden with reviews that are often repetitive and that unnecessarily slow down broadband expansion. And I want to thank Chairman Latta for including my discussion draft in today's legislative hearing, and thank you to our witnesses for your insight. We really have to break down the barriers to deployment that are keeping folks like those I represent in rural Appalachia on the wrong side of the digital divide. Commissioner O'Reilly, you and I have worked together on this for a long time. It's so frustrating to me that here in 2023 we're talking about the same problems that we were talking about in January of 2011. We're just not making progress on rural broadband, and this is a common sense thing that can really make a difference. Mr. Romano, your testimony discussed the difficulties and lengthy delays your members have experienced when obtaining permissions through environmental, historic preservation, and consultation processes for broadband deployment. How often do you have to perform an environmental or historic preservation review for simply adding or upgrading wireless facilities on existing infrastructure?
So the way the NEPA and NHPA work essentially is if we are deploying on federal lands or essentially using federal funds, those are going to trigger
So
the kinds
anytime
of
the
reviews.
federal government's involved, you have to do all
That essentially is correct. I mean, there are categorical exclusions under NEPA that can apply, that can take one out of that, but oftentimes it can't even take time to figure out whether one qualifies for categorical exclusion, and a number of the projects do.
Gotcha. In your view, does the amount of time, effort, and cost for these reviews detract from the incentive for providers to upgrade existing wireless infrastructure, and what does this mean for consumers?
I think and I'll pick up a point that Mr. Saperstein made earlier about the sort of transparency and the predictability of this. The inability to know for certain how long this is going to take, what exactly is going to be required, can be a deterrent to participation in some of these programs or otherwise to invest in these areas. I will say the incentive to invest, our members are based in the communities they serve, so they've got strong incentives to do it anyways, but particularly participating in expansion programs, that can be a real deterrent.
Gotcha. Mr. Saperstein, same question. In your view, does the amount of time, effort, and cost for these reviews detract from the incentive for providers to upgrade existing infrastructure?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, co-location is one of the most efficient things we can do as a society to spread wireless deployments. It makes use of existing infrastructure, it allows multiple carriers to serve an existing area, and it reduces the overall effect on the local community. So absolutely.
Okay. Mr. O'Reilly, and again, it's good to see you. The last time I think I saw you maybe when you came out to see some of the rural aspects of my district and the struggles that we have there with broadband. In your testimony, you mentioned the importance of permitting reform for wireless connectivity, including for 6G. Can you expand on what reforms will be helpful for future 6G deployment?
So 6G is expected, and it's still early, the discussion stage, but it's expected to use higher frequencies, so both mid-bands and super high bands. And in doing that, you're going to have more towers, more infrastructure that's absolutely necessary. And so that means more co-location, it means more placement of towers, it means new construction of big towers and small cells and antennas. And all of that's going to need approval, and all of that's going to go through the molasses that we've been talking about today.
Okay. Are there any particular reforms you would recommend to increase the efficiency of current 5G deployment?
Well, permitting is at the top of my list. Permitting and pole attachment, both the rates and access are at the top of my list. I've talked about other aspects that the committee can focus on. We talked about railroads briefly. I put railroads in that category as well.
You know, we used to have an anti-drug campaign in America. The big byline was just say no. God, we need the federal government to just say yes to some of these things that are common sense. This is mind-boggling to me. Mr. Chairman, thanks again. I appreciate you letting me weigh on the committee. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And seeing no other members wishing to ask questions, I want to thank our panel of witnesses today for your expertise and your time today. We greatly appreciate it. You can tell from the interest in the members that this is a very, very important topic that we're dealing with. I ask unanimous consent to insert in the record the documents included on the staff hearing documents list. Without objection, so ordered. I remind members that they have 10 business days to submit questions for the record, and I ask the witnesses to respond to the questions quickly. Members should submit their questions by the close of business on May the 3rd, and without objection, the subcommittee is adjourned.
Hey, pull hair.
Thank you so much. That issue. That complied. I was worried for a while. I appreciate your flex. I know. Thank you so much. Already there. Thank you. Thank you, Katie. I mean, that's memorable. I would never support that, right? That was
left a pig over there. Yeah, some kind of like, I don't know if it's a pig or something.
There's a, it's in here. No, it's in here.
Holiday's a lot smaller.
Yeah, and I'm not sure how many, so we can wait until Lauren puts out the.
Yeah.
Sorry?
That's right, so that's right. Yeah, and I've heard that number, so I'm gonna go back and see some of overall, you have to file. I think he asked. Yeah, so it's like regulatory for the permit, how much versus the fee, I separate out the fee. So anyway, I didn't want to miss anything.
Yeah, sorry, I no, yeah, that's all good.
Yeah. Yeah. Why the Congress? You signed the treaty testimony for him. I did, and against my, I had the little dot, my little exemptions at the end, the asterisks, right? I didn't want to, I was like, can I get away with those? Because your wording is very, there are 4 positions. So there's like, so I have to say yes. It's better to say yes. Nobody cared. Yes, get to a big crowd. I tried. You did get a vocal reaction.
I love when you were like, I saw this letter yesterday.
Exactly. Yeah. You signed it.
Yeah.
Right.
You used to come and cry about how you want more money, you want this too.
We're so offensive to the kidding. Give us money first, and then you can give it to someone else. If we don't want, I was like, no, we're never going to do that. Yeah. We're never going to do that. But now that you are doing this,
Oh, I mean, the fact that they're explicitly eligible in this also requires them, like, in this way, the exception if they accept the
it's too narrow. I'm telling you, it's too narrow. You got to go more. That's as far as we can get out of the human go. Well, that's also, as I'm saying, they all, and the board members. So I get that, but someone can offer at least an amendment and say, oh, we're going to work on this on the floor. So I don't know, something, this got to be, this is not enough. Yeah. Thanks for all. I was afraid of it. I know. I wrote a question. It's not an easy topic, right? It's not fun either, but it's how much this relief in energy, other relief. Life is all great. Then fix one little thing here. It's I was gonna put it out of the hearing. He's like, our guys still they're okay with it.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, that's good. Yeah, I don't know. I'm not doing something like that too. Seems like we can do it. I feel like our neighbors are waiting to get Shirley to. I might Republicans can have too. I know it's electrical.
Really?
Yeah, of course.
Could you collect the water bottles, because I want to put cold ones.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, all the ones in the fridge are.
Yeah, so I took out, I put 19 on top of the fridge that we'll use, and then these will go back in the trash.
Or sometimes the partners is there. It's really not for dogs.
And it totally depends, like some people talk about their
I don't think, I think T and I would get jurisdiction. Can't you do again, 224? Oh, for 220. And also, is there a definition for?
Are you getting the waters?
Yeah, the waters are just waiting for you to, so we know how many there are.
The big issue is, it's,
Yeah, okay.
they're starting state property, so it would be a 253 issue to say we preempt that as it relates to. The statute in Virginia is actually a bit too terrifying. I was trying to figure out if I could pronounce the next one. Virginia, Nebraska, a bunch of those states are, again, it's right, I mean, we'll see how it goes. They're not making this legislation.
Are you more reserved for witness things up here?
No, those are all the reserved for witness ones we have up here right now.
Okay, I'll go up here more.
That's fair, you don't wanna fight 25 different laws. Yeah. And they're not in a position to fight right now. Yeah. Thanks so very much, Mike.
Yeah,
Thank
thank
you
you.
for flying back, thanks for flying back for this too.
Happy to.
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, all good. It's fine, Miss Rock.
Got it, yeah.
Hey. Miss Rogers Washington.
Okay, yeah.
I double checked it, but it's still not here. That's top priority right now.
Okay, I'll go
Just to
get
get that. Thank you.
Oh, like the names?
The reserve side.
Oh, no.
Hey, Noah, do you have Mrs. Rogers Washington that I could use?
I didn't collect, it should
I
be here. I didn't.
What, I collected them for you.
Oh, you need what, you need that here.
I need one,
Gotcha, yeah.
if that's okay.
Oh, did you actually get, do you have one now?
Yep, but I mean, we'll still need to replace it, so I'm delegating to you, because I'll be in here.
There you go. So, from the stack that you have.
So,
Hey.
C&T, yeah, I checked it.
I'm doing well, how are you? So that's
I
the O and
kinda
I one that was missing?
Oh, and I was missing a Mrs. Rogers Washington.
I'll just text you.
So, but now C&T is going to be missing a Mrs. Rogers. So go ahead and just say it's from